sit at your sides, and meaning all of you, of course. Wie viele Minuten später möchtest du anfangen? Das wäre jetzt, aber meine Frage ist einfach nur...
Yeah, but I have them here.
Ja, gut. Ja.
Ich kann mal so da sein.
Veranstalter einwählen, den kannst du sagen.
Genau, wenn ich veranstalte.
Okay. Eine Sekunde.
Ja.
Okay, perfekt.
Ja, danke.
Ja?
Ja, achso, willst du noch?
Sorry. So, you. You can save it under the documents on file. I can do it for you. No, no.
Oh, okay,
No,
yes.
File, then you go on documents, salva con nome, yeah, documenti.
Desktop?
No, documenti. Slide here, 19 aprile. Here, this.
Questo?
Yeah, sì. Okay.
What do you have to do? Okay, thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. We are very glad that you returned to listen to this outstanding panel of speakers. You will understand that for the sake of content, I cut the introduction short. Our first speaker is Wolfgang Kerber. He is professor for economic policy at the University of Marburg, and he is, if I may summarize what I noted over years from your work, deeply into competition law, intellectual property law, consumer law, the overall picture on the economic background. We are very much looking forward to your talk.
Many thanks for this nice introduction and having me here. So you are getting now presentations from two economists, also Fernando, so from a different perspectives therefore. Now, I come from policy making and from economic policy, so I always like to start with the problems that we want to solve with the Data Act. And so the problem is that manufacturers of smart devices can get through their own technical design exclusive de facto control over all data generated by the device. This is a starting point. And therefore we have access problems for users, and we have access problems for other firms who would like to have these data for providing services also to the users, but also for data-driven innovation quite generally. The problems are therefore, and there's a broad consensus about this, we have negative effects on innovation and underutilization of data right now. We have competition problems, especially on secondary markets, as repair service markets. There are negative effects on choice of users of these IoT devices, and no fair sharing of the value of the data. And I think these last 2 points is what we have mostly in mind now in in our conference, and I also focus only on D2C in that respect. We have two key instruments in the Data Act. One is these new rights for users to access IoT data and share them, so Article 4 and 5, and the other is this need for a contract between data holder and user about the use of non-personal data. For personal data, we have the GDPR. Can these instruments be expected to work? Now, regarding the user-initiated data sharing mechanism, Article 5, I am very skeptical. I have written about this. I think this is a very weak and largely ineffective mechanism. Too many restrictions, hurdles, legal problems, high transaction costs. So I am skeptical whether the Data Act will lead to much more innovation and competition. Now the new data use contract, and this is what I will focus on for non-personal data, Article 413. This is conceptually a far-reaching contract, yeah, because it eliminates the current de facto option of data holders to directly use and monetize the data, what they have technically captured from my perspective. And therefore, the Data Act changes the bundles of rights really by assigning this data to the users. Theoretically, this looks like a very strong position, but can they use it, the consumers? And the Data Act says nothing about this contract, so we have far-reaching freedom of contract here. Now, on this slide, you see a slide from my Münster panel presentation, summarizing what I will do also, but I will go much deeper than I could there. So I will show that there will be an existence of serious market failures, information behavior problem, and the expected market result will be that the consumers will have to accept contracts with very broad consents to the use of all collected non-personal data by data holders for the entire life cycle of the IoT device, buyout contracts. Decisive is that manufacturers can bundle the sale contract with the data use contract. And if the data use contract is terminated, then they can brick this IoT device so the users cannot use it anymore. In that respect, the allocated rights of non-personal data to the users will be contracted away. And the consumers will be left with non-waivable user rights of these Article 4 and 5. And therefore, this is a problem for consumer choice, but also for the fair distribution of value from this non-personal data. And possible solutions are one in compensating the users for that, the other giving consumers more control over their IoT data. Now, all of this is about, and also what I've written about the Data Act was always only about the non-personal data, but now we want to go broader. And therefore, I think a very important characteristicum of Data Act is that it's also rules for personal data or mixed data sets. And I think this is very important. I think this is a big advantage of the Data Act that it also covers personal data. Now, the second problem is a very much more difficult problem. We all know we have strict rules, GDPR, but the problem is that these rules do not help much consumers for meaningful control over the data. So the GDPR does not fulfill its task of really giving the consumers really the instruments for protecting their privacy and also for a fair participation in the value of the consumer data. So GDPR is not an answer, GDPR is a problem, also in that respect. And therefore, GDPR, I think, needs more help. And Data Act can be seen as an instrument for helping also GDPR, at least perhaps in future reforms of Data Act, not right now. And therefore, the whole Data Act policy discussion, I think, should also entail personal data, where all the fundamental problems come with. And now I would like to emphasize an additional point, which is very important for me. I think we're talking about Internet of Things. And this is a very fundamental technological innovation because it integrates the offline world into the online world. So in the future, there might be no offline world anymore in which there are not a lot of connected IoT devices which are constantly monitoring us and collecting data, and we cannot avoid them anymore. And I think this is a very fundamental issue for privacy, and therefore I think we should be very clear that these IoT are surveillance instruments, and therefore we should really think about what we really want that they are doing with us. Yeah? And GDPR and DA does not consider this. Okay, so the economics of IoT, So the next step will be about market failures on the markets for personal and non-personal data. And the economics of IoT data, only one slide, and we all, I think, most of this know this. Data is non-drivers in use. Important for the economics of IoT devices is that IoT devices are sold for a price. And then additionally, you can also pay with your data, additionally. This is important for the economics of this. And so personal anonymity can be part of the counterprofit, but only a part of it. And this has very important consequences for the need, also whether the data holders need really data monetization for having enough incentives. I think, so other people think that it is not necessary that manufacturers and data holders need these data for giving them enough incentives for investing in IoT devices. That's not necessary. I think this is one of the wrong assumptions of the Data Act. Now to the value of consumer data, I think Fernando also said something yesterday in the discussion. It's very complex. The value for the firm depends on the use of the device, or how much they are using it, characteristics of users, intended purpose of use, can it be shared, etc. This is very complex and very different. And what we are usually not talking about is what is the value for the consumer of these consumer data. And this means what is the value for the consumer of not sharing data. We have already heard yesterday that these data can also be used for personalized pricing, and they can also be used for more informational manipulation, and therefore this can be the detriment of the user also if they have more data. This only as a small reminder of this aspect also. Now data use contracts. How would a well-functioning market work? So we look now at this contract between the data holder and the user about non-personal data, but at the same time it's a data use contract between the data subject and the data controller. Huh? Both contracts, and from my perspective, it makes not much difference. Yeah, it makes difference legally in detail, but not in the effects. So the point is, what you're doing, very important is now that in IoT markets, we have competition between IoT manufacturers. And that's why different situations than with Meta and with Google or something like that, we have competition here. Yeah? But the users have different preferences about privacy and whether and how their IoT data should be used and with whom they are shared and what could be collected. So we have heterogeneous preferences. Yeah? Now, we would assume that a well-functioning market, if there is competition between IoT manufacturers, then they would offer different data use contracts. Some who would more consider now privacy and others less, and there might even be that some offer voluntarily payment for this data because it's a licensing contract and others would not, and you would think that there's competition about this. And then you would really get terms of data use contracts aligned with consumer preferences. This is how a market really would work if it would work well. Yeah? A small note, if consumers would want then the rights to access, use and sharing of data of Article 4 and 5 DA, in a well-functioning market, they would get it voluntarily by the firms. So you won't need a regulation. This means, vice versa, that the Data Act itself does not assume that we have a well-functioning market for IoT devices and this data use contract. Yeah? Otherwise, there would be no need for regulation. And we have this discussion in B2B context where it's not clear whether we have a problem. Yeah? So what market failures exist in IoT devices? So there's a long discussion about how do markets for personal data work. And the interesting thing is that GDPR itself has introduced de facto a market for personal data. If you have information self-determination and you have freedom of contract, then you get a market. This is a logical consequence. But has never analyzed really the market failures that come with this market for personal data. And this is a huge mistake, and this has to be done much more systematically. And this is now better done, and I think we will also hear a lot of Fernando about this information behavioral problems, but especially also he will talk about positive and negative data externalities and what consequences this has for privacy, and you see we have very serious problems with that. Now I focus on these information behavioral problems on markets for data. It's a well-known problem. I don't have to repeat it. Lacking transparency, consent fatigue, transaction costs, behavioral manipulation, nudging, and all this, yeah, is very well. There's a very good article of Metzger, Schweitzer, and Wagner about this. It's in German, who really summarizes very well, and they like data markets, but they also make a very good analysis of the market failures, and then it's very clear there are problems. It's not easy. Yeah? So in that respect, and what Heike Schweitzer always has said is this data price, so that to pay with data, people don't understand what this is because you cannot measure it, and therefore understand it, and therefore this price cannot fulfill its role in a market. Yeah? And therefore it does not work. And therefore we get a race to the bottom, and too much data collection is a consequence of this. Yeah? And therefore individual consent as instrument for rational decision of consumers about data privacy does not work. And this is a huge problem for GDPR. Now applying this to IoT data and IoT devices and this data use contract, and if you look at this and think this through, then there is not much difference. The consumers also do not understand the data price as part of their payment, what this means and how high this is. Yeah? And therefore, and what they're getting for the data, and also what risks they are really, if a lot of their data is really collected or not for them. And the important point is because we have this market failure with regard to this part of this counter performance. Yeah, competition will not lead to data use contracts that fit to the preferences. Yeah, you get a race as a problem with regard to the data use contract. Yeah, otherwise you can have competition. That's the point. Yeah, and therefore you get these buyout contracts and this bundling of contracts, and there's this lock-in in the IoT device for the entire lifetime of the device. Yeah, this is a consequence of the market failure. That's the point. Yeah. So competition with more privacy, IoT devices will most often not work. If someone is offering this, users do not choose it because they don't understand it, and therefore this dimension of competition does not work. So the effects now on the sharing of the value of data. How are the effects of the sharing? Now we have price competition still. We have competition, so we can expect that there's price competition. And therefore, if the costs are decreasing due to the use of these data, then we can expect that also prices will go down to some extent. Yeah? And if prices go down, then to the lower market price, the consumers get some kind of compensation, and we cannot ignore this effect. Yeah? How well does this mechanism work? In a model of perfect competition, it works quite well. Outside of this, it depends. Yeah? So there might be some compensation, but much can also be uncompensated. Needs much more research. Now the results are, we have seen market failures and too much collection of data, and the consumers cannot really get fulfilled their preferences, have not enough choice. Now the fundamental question is now, what do we want? Do we want fair compensation for all these much data that they have to give? Or do we want more choice and control of the data for the consumers? Yeah? So what data are generated, collected, used, and shared, and then enabling well-functioning markets. This is a bit consumer sovereignty, or data sovereignty of the consumers, you can also call this. And I would remind you, IoT devices are surveillance instruments. This control is important. Now, I want to go a bit in a discussion about minimum standards of choice. So going on the choice discussion. And I will be brief. A very important point was the German Facebook case was about data combination. And and they have seen the terms of the contract as an exploitative abuse of a dominant firm. And the point was that there was no additional choice for the data combination. Yeah? And the remedy, that's interesting, the remedy was really an additional choice for data combination. Yeah? And the criterion was the violation of GDPR, forced consent, not enough choice. Yeah? Now, this has been picked up by the Digital Market Act. It's Article 5.2, prohibition of data combination, but with options for consent. Yeah? And it's interesting that the Digital Market Act is about competition, but the discussion about Article 5.2 is entirely about choice and conditions of choice. Yeah? Now, this led to the Facebook case to a very lively discussion about also in the data protection law, as a market power, especially market dominance, should be a criterion in data protection law because of imbalance of power, and then they have not a valid consent anymore. This is the argument. Yeah? And this led to ideas where the dominant firms, according to Article 102, dominant firms, can this lead, have their special responsibility also for data protection? Yeah, this was Graf and others who have done this. And so does market dominance lead to an invalid consent? And then you have the meta decision, which was also mentioned by Andreas yesterday, where they clearly say that EGJ dominance can be a factor, but alone dominance is not enough. Yeah? And therefore, it's not so easy. It's not so easy. But perhaps unavoidability of a service might be important. So if you cannot avoid the service, and then you are more on the level of the DMA and the gatekeepers, because they are so powerful that you cannot avoid these core platform services anymore. A small remark, Luisa Specht and I made 2021 a proposal of an additional obligation of the DMA, in the DMA, which goes beyond Article 5.2. We said we should have an obligation that gatekeepers should offer also a choice between paying with personal data and the monetary fee. So not only about a combination of data, but about collecting of data itself. Yeah? Now, Meta has introduced something like that in the meantime. You can pay for social media with money and can choose. Yeah, something is happening, and this also is a consequence, I think, also of developments in data protection law, which also happening. And this is also linked to the time prohibition, Article 7.4 GDPR. I don't want to go into the specifics, but what we also have is these poor subscriptions in Germany in newspapers, where you can choose whether we be advertising or not. And interesting is, newspapers are in competition with each other. So it's not the case of Meta, it's a different case. Yeah, we are in the case of firms. But then the question came up, is the price for the pure subscriptions justified? And I think they are concerned that it's much too high in comparison to the consumer value of the value of the data for the newspapers. So what we are getting right now in data protection law and data protection authorities, there's also an international discussion in the data protection board about this, really a discussion about what should be the maximum price. Yeah, and the idea is always the price too high for paying for not giving data, then this is not a real choice anymore. That's the argument. Yeah? It's prohibited in an economic perspective. So they start right now to asking economists about this, but this is a very discussion infancy, so it is starting. But now perhaps we can learn something from the US. There are very interesting recent developments in Californian privacy law, and there's a very good article of Kühling and Schwarz, December last year. They have now a new California Privacy Protection Agency, and what they have, you know, in California privacy law, they have an opt-out model. Yeah? But you can also give an opt-out preference signal to the consumers, and then the difference is not so much anymore between opt-in and opt-out. And the point is that if firms collect consumer data because they are selling a product or selling or services, then the consumers can opt out. Yeah, that's the idea. Now, but the point is, and this is a decisive point, if now consumers use this opt-out option, then they should not have any harm through this opt-out. Meaning, and this is here, I think, as a non-discrimination principle, should not be discriminated against consumers who use the opt-out option, but differentiation with regard to the price, for example, is allowed if a reasonably related test is fulfilled. And this is now, so charging a consumer a different price or rate, or providing a different level or quality of goods or services to the consumer is okay, if that difference is reasonably related to the value provided to the business by the consumer's data. And that's exactly, yeah, I give my data, they get value from that, yeah, and this is exactly the benchmark here, what they are using, yeah. Now, if you analyze this is a mandatory pay or okay solution, so it's mandatory. It's a very far-reaching regulation also, in which can firms claim a price if comes to opt out, but the firms have to justify how high the price is. That's the point, yeah? So it's a non-discrimination principle with a de facto price regulation. That's the point, yeah? They apply very broadly, but it's also clear it should be a pragmatic solution, yeah? And now I think the most interesting thing is that CCPA, so the Data Protection Authority, has started to develop rules for implementation and what kind of economic calculation methods firm can use for justifying such price differences. Meaning that they're developing methods for measuring the value of consumer data for firms. Yeah, it's not the market price of data. It's really the value for the firms in that respect. Yeah? Now the CCPA is pragmatic. There's a lot of different methods. They are starting to do this right now, very open. There's a lot of critical discussions about this. I don't want to go into this. I have not had time starting to look deep into this, so I don't want to say much about this. The decisive point is something very interesting is starting here, which does not exist in the same way in Europe, I think. That's an interesting thing. Perhaps we can learn something. Now, some critical reflections about this idea of pay and okay solutions. I don't go into the fundamental discussion about this, but important question is, what should the price be? Do we need price controls if we go in this direction? Yeah? And are consumers capable to make such a choice? Because you have still information available. Or do they really do what they always do? Do they always choose a cheaper version with data? Yeah, this has to be analyzed, but very important. If you are putting a price on this, and you can choose and see an explicit price, this can increase awareness about the value of data, and therefore perhaps consumers learn and change their attitudes. This might be very interesting. Yeah? And the tricky question is, and I think Dr. Staubenmauer yesterday already mentioned this, who compensates whom? Yeah? Do the firms pay for the data through a lower price? Or do the consumers pay with money for their privacy? And economically it's the same, but it's a different framing. That's exactly what we had, I think, already yesterday. Yeah? Now, policy options. I will also be brief. So one is this idea requiring a direct compensation for personal and non-personal data. And this is an interesting idea, doing it mandatory. But the question is, what exactly should be, what kind of value do you mean? Compensation for the entire value, or only the uncompensated part of the value? Or only for the data that are not necessary for functionality, so there are different options. And it's very clear, it is very difficult to calculate this, and perhaps you can learn something from Californian methods. This will be huge regulatory and compliance cost. I'm a bit skeptical about this, and I think more interesting is more choice, much more fundamental. And one is the idea using this, applying this pay with money or data principle also to IoT devices. And you can also think you are selling IoT devices, and you can get one version where you give your data, another version where you do not your data. And then there's a price difference, and you have the same idea. So I think this should be also thought through. But how to calculate this, the problem is you might have many functions in an IoT device. Perhaps you need more than one price difference, depending on the choosing. I don't want to go too deep in this. What's interesting is that this pay or okay solution might also be a solution for a very important problem if the consumers terminate the data use contract. What happens then? And then this would be an easy way, because if we have this, then it would mean that then they can still use IoT device, but they have to pay the additional price, which is regulated, and therefore no problem. Also, if you are selling the IoT device to the new buyer, and the new buyer does not want to sign all these data use contracts, then I can pay a price. This would be an easy solution if you use this kind of. Then you can go in a much more broad direct regulation of the minimum standard for choice. Yeah? And the problem is that, as I've understood, and Andreas Weder talked about 2 weeks ago, the GDPR does not really provide a right to a minimum of choice. There has to be transparency, no imbalance of power, but not really a right really of granular decisions. Yeah? And therefore we have a problem. They can bundle this. And a DA does not give this also for non-personal data, very clear. Yeah? So in that respect, the question is, if you want that the consumer have a more choice with regard in a granular way, what is the data is collected, for whom is it shared with, and what they are doing with the data, then you have to need a real regulation and regulate this, and I think this is entirely fine doing this. Yeah, what can be option for minimum of choice? The right to terminate the contract, for example, what happens then? Okay, but also do a right to use an IoT device, for example, also offline. A refrigerator, why not offline? We're doing this all the time. Or anonymously. Yeah? Or without collection of data. There's an old idea of Max Becker, data avoiding products, as an example, only for giving some ideas. Yeah? Then one step more. What is very important is that the Data Act presupposes a certain governance model of IoT devices. And the governance model is always that the manufacturer of the IoT device has de facto control over everything what's happening with the IoT device. Yeah, the data, but also the IoT device themselves, and controls this, and this for the entire lifetime of the product. Yeah? And this is the basic assumption, and it's not clear why we need this. Yeah? There might be other data governance solutions. One thing we already have discussed a bit yesterday was why the consumer cannot choose who the data holder is. And the point is, it's interesting because the Data Act views the users as the owners of the IoT data, and therefore it's not trivial. But more interesting is that in the discussion about the GDPR, about Article 20 data portability right, we always defended Article 20 GDPR because it's good for competition, because it reduces switching costs and then leads to competition between platforms. That's exactly what the Data Act does not want. The Data Act wants that the consumers are locked in this product and does not help switching at all. So the data consumers can also not decide that if the IoT data are transmitted to a data trustee, for example. Why not? And who is an agent of the consumers? These are all other governance options which are not even thought about in the Data Act discussion. And for example, as an example, I want to say an old discussion about connected cars. Since 2016, there was always the idea that there might be a very different concept for the governance of car data. So not this extended vehicle concept of the car manufacturers, but for example, a shared server, a data trustee solution, where all data are then under the shared server, which is a kind of data trustee solution, or much more ambitious, an on-board application platform, which is under technical solution, which allows the car users directly to control the data and also decide who should get the data and also access to the car. And there is a study of the Commission, the old study, TRL study 2017, which clearly said that these two solutions are better than the concept of the car manufacturers. Yeah? Luis and I, we also thought a bit about the data solution for car data. My last slide. What also might be very interesting is PIMS. I entirely agree with Andreas on that. Yeah, as I read it, so that this data use contract can only be concluded via PIMS, which might also have negotiation power and therefore a different situation and better management of consent and all of this. And the other aspect I also would emphasize at the end, one of the problems of the Data Act was always it's a horizontal regulation on very different things. And therefore, it was always clear we need also sometimes sector regulations. And I think we should have more sectoral regulation and also perhaps IoT-specific rules about minimum standards of choice. So, and not doing it generally, so doing it more specific, targeted really on the problems. And one example is again the connected car. The Commission was very clear about that the Data Act is not sufficient for solving the problems of connected cars, KDR, and therefore they initiate a policy initiative in March 2022, 1 month after the publication of the proposal of the Data Act, and saying, okay, we need more than that. And then they made a new kind of attempt for the type approval regulation, reforming this for connected cars. And I think they had an impact assessment. They are trying this since 2017, and they have, as I have got the idea, the information failed again. It will not be done with the old commission, and it will be on the next policy cycle. This is a real failure. So my final advice is, do not be afraid of mandatory regulatory solutions. We are here under-regulated in many of these fields, but enact only effective regulations that achieve its objective, because I think the Data Act is a mandatory regulation, very complex, but it is will not be very effective. That's my problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. We don't start discussing, although we had quite a lot of to discuss. Nevertheless, we will get more, much more to discuss. I certainly assume.
That's not a problem.
Be careful. By Fernando, also very short introduction, if you allow. Fernando Gomez Pomar is professor of civil law and of law and economics at the University Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, and he is also very famous for many publications and activities. One activity perhaps very relevant in this room, Fernando was member of the expert group for the Common European Sales Law, which at least some tiny elements made it into some other acts, as everyone noted. Yeah, but we try to be modest being involved. In any case, we are very much looking to your paper.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to Alberto Franceschi, Rainer Schulze, and Dirk Staudenmayer for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to share some ideas on how data trade and the value that firms place on data in their dealings with other firms and with consumers influences the legal policy in this field, both in terms of interpretation of the current rules and also on future developments. It's also a pleasure to be back in Ferrara. It's a great opportunity. I was here 35 years ago, and it's been a great reminder how weak memory is, because I had absolutely no recollection of the city. It's like coming here for the first time. This is the outline. I'll go briefly over parts of it, because some of it will be well known to most of you, but a brief introduction, distinguishing direct and indirect trade in data, some evidence about trade in data between firms, and then, the main part of the discussion would be about how the economic features of data have an impact on data markets, and therefore this impact also has an influence on the design of appropriate legal instruments. This point about this phrase of data is the new oil. In fact, I think yesterday Christian Trick-Flessner in his slides had as a background an oil field and data, which is exactly reflecting this kind of metaphor. The data is the foodstuff on which the digital economy runs. So we live in, and there were a lot of mentions yesterday about this kind of excitement in many parts of the world about trade in data and business models using data. But obviously this raises concerns for privacy and for other reasons. And we see that reflected in recent EU legislation. I mean, the Data Governance Act, one of its main focuses is precisely regulation and supervision of data intermediation services. And obviously, we have been discussing extensively about the Data Act and how it affects the exchanges of data and contracts on access to and sharing of data. When one looks at the actual use of data in business models, and I'll come to the figures in a minute, but direct trade in data, so data exchanges in all its forms, although relevant, is not the prevailing form of use of data by firms, by far. Just to give you an illustration, the entire data intermediation service in the world, so all firms engaged in data brokerage or data intermediation had revenue of 8 billion euros last year. That just Google had 40 times more revenue than the entire data intermediation services. Okay, so it's not direct trade in data what is driving the use of data for profitable business models. Again, just 3 of the major players in the digital economy, some of the largest collectors of data from users' online behavior. Google, 98% of its net profit comes from advertising. Facebook is 100%. And Amazon, who is theoretically also a retailer, obtains 60% of its profits from advertising. And these are, again, just a measure of scale, because economies of scale play a role in data markets and in the data economy. These are huge firms, not because we know how huge they are, but because simply Google has a market capitalization almost as large as the entire German stock exchange. So Google is as valuable as all German listed firms put together. And Amazon is as valuable as all Italian or Spanish listed firms together. So simply the size of this thing is really large, okay? And they do not sell data. You cannot go to Google and say, hey, share your data with me. They're going to say, I don't know whether politely or impolitely. No. No. They don't share their data. They don't sell their data. They don't exchange their data. Okay? Google and Facebook essentially sell targeted advertising, and Amazon sells sponsored marketplace listings. This doesn't mean that this is, let's say, innocent, okay? When you enter keywords on Google or on Amazon, you trigger a real-time auction for advertising and listing space. And this is complicated, and this may have impacts on price. So on the final price that consumers pay, not for what they buy on Google or Amazon through those links or hyperlinks, but what they may buy on other channels. So I'm not saying that these kind of business is not problematic for consumers in the end. So it is, or at least it may be, but simply this is not direct data trade, okay? It's indirect data monetization. And in fact, this is not just limited to Google, Facebook, or Amazon. A lot of firms engage in data, in the business of data. They monetize data assets through various things. They, not just by selling raw or processed data, but they sell data reports. They say data analytics. They say consulting services based on data analytics. And they say complementary products or services, okay? Obviously, there is also direct trade in data. I've mentioned that. I mean, data intermediation industry has a revenue of $8 billion, which is sizable. And we do have some evidence. There is an interesting paper summarizing or empirically studying all published data exchanges in the US up to that year. And there are interesting observations and interesting implications from this empirical analysis. For instance, they find that most data exchanged is customers' data. This probably is not a surprise, but data about consumer online activity, financial status, even other sensitive personal data. Perhaps a not so obvious observation. Most of trade is not a sale. Again, I'm not dealing here with the nice details of the characterization of a contract from the legal point of view, but basically what they observe is that data trade is mostly data sharing, not two-way sales of data or one-way sales of data. Data is exchanged for data. Data is rarely exchanged for money, even between firms. Okay? Why is that? Well, there will be problems. Valuing data is problematic, and therefore this makes it translate into a monetary consideration very complicated. But this suggests that an active role in the direct data market, it's not open to everyone. It's basically, it's a restricted market. Only if you have a relatively large installed base of data, you can really actively participate in the direct. Also, evidence shows that who participates in data exchanges, large firms, firms in the same industry. So these are, and this may be problematic from the point of view of competition law. So it's not that you exchange data with someone in a different industry, it's people you're competing with. And obviously firms with large data science capabilities. So you need technical ability, you need to integrate data in a clear business model, you need investment in AI capabilities. Otherwise, data trade is not for you. This is independent of whether the demand for data is driven by internal use of data. I mean, sometimes data is used to reduce costs within a firm. And for instance, there is some evidence that investments in AI and data acquisition go hand in hand with investments in robotics, which means automatization of production and firms. But you may also demand data and try to get data if you're a firm for your interactions with your clients, be they consumers or other firms. And again, those that increase in revenue may be, let's say, benevolent or positive, like, well, you produce more valuable services, more valuable products. you select your customer base better, those who really like your product or service more, but also you may want data to simply be able to exploit your consumers better. It's not that you give them more value for what they are paying, not that you are selecting your customer base better, but you're simply getting more surplus from your consumers than you were doing before you had the data. So this, let's say, the social welfare effects of this may be positive sometimes and not so positive other times. As to the economic features of data and how they impact data markets. Well, it was mentioned before by Wolfgang Kerber. Data shares some characteristics of public goods, non-rivalry, and concerns, or at least just, let's say concerns or problems with the exclusion of access. The second one is in a very apt metaphor by Daron Acemoglu, who was a very famous growth economist at MIT. Data is the lifeblood of AI, which means that there is a strong complementarity between data and artificial intelligence. If you're a firm, if you don't have data scientists and you do not have AI, data is worthless to you. Essentially, the value of data without AI capabilities is very limited. Then collecting, processing, and using data and sharing data have important externalities. In terms of privacy for data subjects, but also in terms of financial interest of consumers. And it also has network effects. And finally, valuing data assets is a complex operation, and there are many factors that play a role in why this valuation is complicated. And obviously, if valuation is complicated, this is going to have a number of effects. There will be transaction costs, and for instance, you will observe a more barter than sale, because it would be difficult to put a price tag on data. Data is non-rival, the same as ideas, inventions, creations, in the sense that if someone uses data, that does not diminish the use of data for anyone else. In principle, data is infinitely usable by an unlimited number of users, and without depleting or diminishing the use for any other person. And which has a very direct implication. And obviously, let's say the condition for this is a very probably exacting condition, but if you keep the cost of use, providing the use constant, and that includes the external cost to consumers, data subjects, and so on, the efficient allocation calls for adding up the value to all potential users. So that actually means that there is a lot of underutilization of data. Underutilization is a large problem with non-rival goods, okay? For instance, the same set of images of human tissue may be used by any tech firm to improve an algorithm for medical diagnosis. Or car driving data can be used by 10 different car manufacturers to increase safety of automated vehicles. And efficiency would call for all of them to be able to use it, because it's non-rival. This is the classical public good non-rival graph, so I won't go into details, but basically is that the marginal benefit of the different users, and here there are only 2 users, but there could be an infinite number. This would add up, and that would lead to an increasingly large optimal quantity of the non-rival good, in this case, data being used. Data also has problems with excludability, and again, obviously, exclusion is much more difficult for individuals with respect to personal and non-personal data than with respect to large packages of data that can be encrypted and controlled by a firm. Their exclusion is less limited, but this may lead to unauthorized uses of data, as well as insufficient incentives to provide data compared to what would be optimal. There's also increasingly among economists the claim that in data there are very important economies of scale, in the sense that the more people use and produce data, the more data is created. Data allowed decisions and predictions by economic agents to improve. At the same time, data is combined with other inputs on production that become more productive because that combination with better prediction and decision outcomes. And this creates economies of scale in data production and use, and increasing returns to scale for those firms who use those complementary inputs. This doesn't mean that as such, data as a factor of production has increasing returns to scale. That is not true, okay? So data has decreasing returns. So having more data improves, for instance, the functioning of artificial intelligence, its accuracy, but at a decreasing rate. This is just a figure of accuracy of an AI using images. The more images, the more data with images you feed into the AI, the better the prediction is. But the accuracy of the prediction increases at the decreasing rate. So the first data are the ones that are more important. In fact, AI without any data is worthless. So, so this is important because many of the complex issues raised by data have to do not with data as such, but with the complementarities of data with other things. And one of those is basically AI, as I mentioned. The main driver of value for data nowadays lies in its use for artificial intelligence. So outside improving the functioning of algorithms and AI tools in general, the commercial value of data is extremely limited. So if you're a firm, you don't have scientists, you don't have AI to train or to learn from the data, data is of little use to you. It's true that you can, obviously those technical capabilities and AI software can be bought outside, okay? So not necessarily you have to make them in-house, but you can also buy them outside. Basically, and here I'm not going through this because I'm sure you're all familiar with the difference between input and feedback data in terms of AI, so that you don't only need input to train an algorithm. Output or feedback data allows your algorithm to improve its accuracy and to improve its predictive capability, and eventually to be able to accommodate and be updated to new circumstances. That's the reason why trade in data and use of AI go hand in hand. And there is now, we start to have a lot of evidence about which are the firms that are, and the sectors that are investing more in AI. Externalities. Basically, data exchanges will present efficiency problems because essentially they may have effects for other people, especially, and this is intuitive but also correct. There may be negative external effects from data collection and data use for consumers or for individuals more generally. And basically, economic theory has identified 3 of these negative external effects. First, direct negative privacy externalities. Basically, if you reveal your data, and this data will be used commercially by a firm, this is going to negatively affect the privacy of other people. Why? Because data, personal and non-personal data, are very often highly correlated. So for instance, if I reveal some personal data to a firm, the firm can use my personal data to make highly accurate inferences about the preferences of people that live close by, because people tend to cluster together. So obviously in terms of income, but also in other areas, because if they like the same neighborhood, they're probably relatively similar people. So even if you are independently sharing your political preferences or your valuation for goods or services to a firm, even if your neighbor is doing nothing and is very privacy concerned, you're actually harming him or her because you're actually revealing information that will be used by the firm to infer data of your neighbor. Closely related to this is basically why people sell their data so cheaply. And the reason is, well, exactly this one. If the information of both consumers is highly correlated, then your consent is not very valuable. And in fact, you expect the other one to sell it cheaply. So in equilibrium, everyone sells data very cheaply because it doesn't matter that much that you don't, because if you don't, your neighbor will do it, and essentially your data will also be worth 0 because the firm will be able to infer your preferences. Okay. That's not the only reason why the actual price we observe for data consent by consumers is close to 0. There may be other reasons, okay? The legal regime is important here about, for instance, the withdrawal of consent. I mean, issues of also of excludability, and also issues of non-contractability. There are things, many people argue that firms will be willing to pay you for your, to consumers, if those contracts will actually be enforceable. For instance, to be, okay, I don't want your personal data, but I want you to view 100 targeted ads every day, and we'll pay you €1 per day. The problem is that contract is not enforceable, because if you don't look at the ads, essentially there is very little way that the firm can monitor that whether you're actually watching them or paying attention. So this kind of negative externality is not the only reason why the price of collecting data from consumers is typically 0. One of the big negative effects from data collection, use, and exchange is, well, essentially that the more data and the more accurate this data is used by firms, firms can, let's say, do bad things with consumers. First, they can absorb a larger share of the surplus, or they can, in the worst cases scenario, essentially manipulate, take advantage of the behavioral biases of consumers, and eventually lead them to do things that they are not in the best interest of consumers. One of the contexts in which this is very relevant is price personalization. We talked about this yesterday a little bit, but it's even beyond price personalization. Price personalization is just one example of this ability to exploit data for the detriment of consumers. Let me here explore a little bit. Well, this is again a kind of standard intermediate micro graph of negative externalities. And again, if you look at an economics textbook, they will tell you there are two orthodox ways to try to internalize the negative externalities, such as the ones I've just been mentioning. One is taxes or liability. For private law, liability is always nicer. And in fact, we do have a liability provision in Article 82 of GDPR. Surprisingly, and I think it's, at least in, I haven't looked very much around, but at least in the literature I've read, we have had recently a number of decisions by the Court of Justice saying that, yeah, this liability provision is fine, but we need full proof of the existence of harm, of the causal connection, and of the amount. This is really not the way. If we are really concerned about privacy externalities, this is not the kind of attitude that one wouldn't expect. And again, with all due respect to the court. But this seems like really depriving liability of a large part of its functionality in this context. The other possibility is to impose quotas or limits. In the case of data shared and used. And you don't really find a clear basis for this, at least I haven't been imaginative enough to find that basis in the GDPR. But still, one could think of limits imposed, and Wolfgang was mentioning mandatory regulation. There could be mandatory regulation. And you could tell Google or Amazon that they cannot use individual data for selling targeted advertising or marketplace listings. There are some people advocating now that they could also only use cohort information. So they can put you in a group with people who have similar rankings of your online behavior, but not tell you, for instance, they cannot use in their auctions for targeted advertising, direct information on your prior purchases, for instance. So there are things that could be done. I mean, I'm not saying they are necessarily good or bad, but this would go in the way of imposing limits as a way to control negative externalities. And I'll probably skip this. There are important network effects, but probably you know about this. Let me go directly to the difficulties in valuation of data assets, which has been mentioned by a number of commentators as an important factor in the way data markets operate. There are many sources of these complexities in valuing data for the purposes of contracting. One is data is heterogeneous, in the sense that data assets differ across many dimensions. Velocity, veracity, volume, variety, the 4 V's, but also the level and the way in which data have been processed. And therefore, this directly impacts, the processing directly impacts whether data can be used beneficially either for saving costs or for enhanced revenue. Another is, as we mentioned that before, is complementarity. A substantial portion of the value of data comes not from data itself, but from complementary products or services. So there is a large variance about the way prospective buyers and users will put the data to, and therefore variance is also an added factor of complexity interfering trade and contracting. Also, they are usually combined or bundled, as Wolfgang was mentioned, with other products or services. And finally, this is probably more pertinent to the legal side, the value of data is largely dependent upon legal factors. The sense, I'm using here the term ownership informally, so legal entitlements over data are not clearly established. We were discussing yesterday whether data is in common law an object of property, whether data has value or not. I mean, all those uncertainties definitely do not enhance trade in data. They hinder trade in data. Also, issues of exclusion of use are relevant, but also the link to privacy externalities. Not only because there may be liabilities if there have been breaches or infringements of the legal framework, such as the GDPR or other legal duties, is that basically the value of a data set depends, remember, the value of a data set is basically for its use for AI. The amount of and precision of inferences that you can make on that data is the basic source of value. And whether your inferences from the data set will be more precise or less precise depends on data protection, depends on privacy. Privacy, to some extent, using statistical terminology, is a source of noise in a data set. So the noisier is a data set, because you have to observe more privacy with respect to the data subjects, the less valuable a data set is. Which means that there's an unavoidable trade-off between data protection and data use. I mean, and this is inescapable, because the more data protection, more noise in data for its use in improving accuracy in prediction, and therefore less value to be obtained from those data. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Of course, we are all tempted to immediately start discussing or continue discussing of yesterday on price personalization or Article 82 GDPR, but we won't do that because we will first get even more input by Vincenzo. Also a very, very short introduction, if I may. Vincenzo Zeno-Zenkovic is professor for comparative law at Roma Tre University, one of the leading comparatives of Italy and beyond. I think you are also president of the Association for Comparative.
Past president.
Past president. In any case, eminent as all our speakers, we are very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks a lot, Hans. Thanks to Alberto and Franceschi for the invitation in Ferrara. It's always an enormous pleasure to be back here in this university and this town. I mean, it's a dream place, and among the many wonderful dreams that we have in Italy, but Ferrara is really special, at least in my view. I will try to present on a very low-level basis, starting from a case, this issue of databases as non-tradable business assets. What is the case? Case in front of the court. It's just pending. There hasn't been a hearing, there hasn't been the opinion of the Advocate General, so case coming from the Warsaw District Court. Anyhow, you find it on obviously on Curia, you find it. So Mr. I has a credit against company NMW. This privacy, you know, just, well, I won't make any comments. Now, as you know, First we had case Smith versus Brown. We have alpha versus beta. Now it's all anonymized. I mean, it's ridiculous, just to point out, I mean, with all the due respect, obviously, towards the excellencies in the Court of Justice, but so it's Mr. I don't know if Mr. I, because it's fictional. They sort of, it's not Mr. I, it's probably someone. Mr. I is accredited against a company. The company is insolvent, and according to, it's a small company, according to Polish insolvency law, if the company is insolvent, there is liability by the managers, and therefore Mr. I brings a claim against the manager, Mr. MW, who is the manager of the company. MW, the manager, claims that the company has assets to pay the creditor because it has two databases of users of an online shopping platform which can be sold in order to satisfy I's credit. So what is it? This company has online shopping platform. The liquidator wants to sell the platform. Obviously, the platform needs a database because a platform without a database, it's just been said, it makes no sense. I mean, you have a platform which it's just a floppy disk. It's nothing. You need a database. And so this is the defense of the manager, and so the Warsaw Court doubts that the database can be sold. Says, can we sell this database? Obviously, be sold. There's all the issue of the sort of the officer, of the serving officer, as in all around Europe. I mean, if you have a liquidation, company is liquidated, or something is seized, there is some public official who must sell the database. So these are the questions put to the Court of Justice. I've synthesized, should Article 5.1.a of the GDPR in conjunction with Article 6 be interpreted as precluding a provision of national law that permits the sale, enforcement proceedings of a database within the meaning of Article 1.2 of Directive 96/9, the database directive. Just to remind you, 4695, which is November of 1995, immediately afterwards there's the database directive. They're joined together from a policy perspective. They're joined together. At least this is how as I saw it developing, I saw it like that. But maybe I was drinking, I was under the fumes, and I was smoking pot or drinking too much wine. So, which contains personal data if the data subject did not consent to such a sale. So this is the issue. So we have the GDPR, we have the database directive. So how do we solve this problem? And so these are some excerpts from the reference to the court. So the only chance of satisfying the applicant's claim is through the conducting of enforcement proceedings in which the assets of the debtor company will be sold to a third party. At the same time, the defendant must demonstrate that such a possibility. The defendant is the manager who says, no, sorry very much, the company has some assets, and therefore you can satisfy your credit with the company. That such possibility is real in the sense that it can be assumed with a high degree of probability that if the creditor, applicant, initiate enforcement, that is Mr. I, enforcement proceedings in respect of a given asset, the enforcement would be effective. A positive answer to that question would lead to the dismissal of the action. Before the action was brought in the present case, such enforcement was conducted and proved ineffective. So this is just, these are some excerpts, so just to point out what are we talking about. It's the question that put by the Polish court makes sense. So there's some doubt as to whether the database created by the company can be traded, and thus whether it can be sold in enforcement proceedings. But on the other hand, the database directive assumes that databases are protected and producer has the exclusive and transferable right to download data and reuse them in whole or in a significant part in terms of quality and quantity. The transferability of that right has been reserved in the directive to the producer. So I have a right over the database, but can I sell it according to the GDPR? And this is what it says. The database in question contains personal data of hundreds of thousands of users. it adds, and this is important because we have also an interesting case in Italy decided by the Court of Cassation, data falling under Article 9 GDPR. The issue of medical data is a huge problem, which obviously in Brussels they don't care anything about medical data, so people can die, and they said people died because of GDPR not allowing the COVID, somehow exchange of data during the COVID pandemic. I mean, it's written in the proposal for data, one of the data directives. So then, further element, the enforcement officer in charge of the sale of the databases becomes the controller and must ensure that the data processed in accordance with the law. So as it is no longer the insolvent company that has the control because it is the enforcement officer, then obviously the enforcement officer, if I were the enforcement officer, I would be very worried, you know, that immediately the data protection authority says, listen, you sold something you couldn't sell, and here you have 1 million zloty of fines or whatever, very high fines. So you can imagine the enforcement officer is very worried in what could happen if he sells something that he is not allowed to sell according to the law. And there's no evidence that the data subjects have consented to the sale of their data to third parties or their use outside activities of the online sale platform. Consent to the processing of data for the purposes of using the functionalities of a platform does not mean consent to processing for any possible purpose or to sharing data with any other entity. So this is what the court, this is the finding of the court. And the sale of the database does not fall within the public interest exception. We know all these various exceptions because it is meant to protect an individual interest. And it could be seen, you know, that if you think of money and the registry of the enterprises and at the Camera di Commercio, Italian Camera di Commercio, it's all around Europe, we have chambers of commerce, and that it said, well, that is a public interest to disclose that data, but this is not the case. It could be seen as pursuing the public interest in as much as law enforcement procedures strengthen trust in the state and general interest of the judiciary, because I have a credit and I have no remedy and I don't know how to satisfy my remedy. However, one could debate if the sale is a proportionate measure. So, and then court says, what happens if someone Chinese comes along and entity outside the EU? So transfer of data, or American company, transatlantic transfer of data. And finally, this is the final point of the set by the court, is that the essence of a sui generis right to a database is the possibility of downloading, reusing those data. Negative answer to the question may in fact lead to the producer of the database being deprived of the ability to make the data available to third parties, reuse. So this is the case. We'll see what the decision is, but I'm willing here to make a bet with all of you, but I mean, sort of that the solution of the Court of Justice will be that lacking the consent of data subject, databases cannot be sold. The GDPR and the court's case law are quite firm on the need of a specific consent to transfer the data to a third party. So this is, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I gave this as a sort of an open books case to my students in Luxembourg, a data protection class, and they came out, some came out with some interesting replies. I said, take sides, are you on what side? And so they came out with some solutions, but the majority said, well, there's no chances. The database cannot be sold. Out of 20, let's say 18 or maybe 16 said, no, you can't be sold. And I tend to believe that this is a solution. So let's move from this case. Let's do sort of like we do in the US law school. We pass from a case to discussing the case and understanding what are the consequences of the case and the decision, the reasonably predictable decision by the Court of Justice saying that no consent, no change. So, first of all, let's look at it from the firm. I'm a firm, I'm a serious firm, and I have a database, and I follow and I have my accounting services. Maybe I'm listed, I'm even listed, so I even more abbreviations. And so what will I apply? IAS, International Accounting Standards, Articles Standard 38 of the IAS, for which established very long, it's about 20 pages, but I'll summarize the points. Non-tangible assets obviously includes patents and things like that, and trademarks and so on, but includes also in the list, if we look at the list in IAS 38, customer and supplier relationships, including customer lists, should be listed in the balance sheet. Surely as a cost, so this is the point, how much did you spend to acquire this, this customer list, but also as an asset if they are quote unquote, capable of being sold, transferred, licensed, rented, or exchanged. Now, if the Court of Justice says, no, you cannot be sold, transferred, licensed, rented, or exchanged because there's no consent, and generally we would expect that there isn't consent, the issue, well, we can talk about, but then it becomes very generic. You don't know where this very broad consent is. The validity of a very broad consent is highly debatable and can be challenged. So first point is I'm a company. I have a value. I have a database. Do I put it in my balance sheet? Boo. Then further element. Sorry, I mean this is the daily life of a of a balance sheet. I mean you have to have the issue of an asset should be amortized. And look at it every year. If it has a finite life, every year you should see what is the lifespan of this database. Obviously, one could say the very old data become obsolete very quickly, certain data. So obviously, you can sort of look at it what the lifespan of this database is. But there's a further element. Here we enter into the field of classical private law and company law. Why are our balance sheets of a company public? Why are they made public? Because I rely on that balance sheet. I know what the assets are. I know exactly, and I decide. Let's know your client. Just think of Basel III. I must know everything. I know there's a company. This company has certain assets, and I value those assets, and I rely on those assets. I know also I lend money I'm a bank, I lend money to the company because I know that if I'm not repaid, I will satisfy myself on the assets of the company. So what happens is that we have a database which is among the assets, but only for the use of that company, but cannot be transferred, sold, liquidated, exchanged, nothing. It dies with the company. And here we have to, what kind of companies? We were looking at the kind of companies. Obviously, data companies. Paradoxically, one could say that if Meta and Google cannot sell their data, they have no value. They have a value, but just to point out that they can't sell this data. So we should distinguish between data companies, companies that collect data and reuse it. They provide services. Just think of all the hundreds of apps. Hundreds of apps, they just provide a service and collect data from this service they're providing, and then they aggregate this data and they sell this data for whatever purpose they can do. So that is a data company. And then we should look at non-data companies, just like any company that uses, an automobile producer is not a data company. It sells automobiles, but it needs data on the automobiles, just to show this element. So the database is an ancillary role, but if I want to, how can I sell a company if I don't sell also the database? I can't sell it. And we don't have only insolvency issues, but we have also mergers and acquisitions. As a matter of fact, the issue was raised when Meta bought WhatsApp, and so the data that went from WhatsApp to to Meta. So it's a very complex issue. And then finally, sorry, I mean, it's just, I'll put it with an acronym, it's just pure BS in Brussels, when in Brussels they say there's non-personal data. All data is personal. All data is personal except from meteorological data and large statistical data. All the rest of data, and especially business data is also personal data. Even when you have IoT, when you have machine to machine, there's always someone behind there, that some individual, some in the context around, that somebody, and this data that is collected is not non-personal data, it's always personal data. And there will always be some data protection authority would say, hey, you must separate. Quite impossible. You can't separate personal data from non-personal data. So just to point out that the issue of databases and as a value, as a tradable asset and a valuable asset of a company is a complex. Now let me, what could some alternatives be? Obviously this is an alternative, I mean, in a very optimistic view, and sort of thinking that the Court of Justice, they drink a bottle of cognac, grappa, and a bit of champagne, and they have a different view, and they change their view. Just think that Directive 46 and the GDPR says is not only data protection, but free movement of data. So if there's no free movement, if you can't trade with your database, there's no free movement. I mean, this is generally completely forgotten by, in Luxembourg, Brussels, and by the data protection authorities. Free movement of data. Free movement of data is not simply, it's the fact that I have a database and I want to sell it. And so otherwise there's no market. There's no market in databases. Then there's a further element. This will come to my final conclusions. The notion that they have, that is in the GDPR, was in the directive, is a sort of a very personalistic data. It's only mine. It's mine. It's not, please don't look at my, they have the idea that data is as if it were a piece of one's finger, a nail, hair. No, data in our society are in 99% are shared data. Sorry, I was Teresa Rodriguez. Co-generated. This is, when you, any kind of relationship, whether you have a contract, tenant, landlord, tenant, employer, employee, buyer, vendor, whatever, a group, an association, we share data. They do not belong only to us, they belong also to someone else. This is completely forgotten. And so when this data is, it belongs, well, more people are entitled to this data. Obviously, how do you regulate this entitlement? So only one can say, oh, but you are not allowed to use this data. I mean, this is, you know, it is somewhat complex, just to say that having a view that you have this exclusive entitlement to my data, and beware, you're not going to use this data without my consent. And so solution could be, for example, and I've mentioned this Radio Shack decision. What happened? Radio Shack went in liquidation, Chapter 11 in the US 20 years ago. And they wanted to sell, the liquidator wanted to sell all the data. It was pre-digital, it wasn't very digital. But it was millions of data. And they was immediately acclaimed Attorney General, it was a Texas case, Attorney General said, hey, we have a privacy issue here. And so what was, they were sold, but they were commitments by the buyer. So the court somehow directs and says, well, in this case, in the case it is pending in front of the Court of Justice, the Court of Warsaw courts would say, well, listen, we could these are the instructions for selling it. Or they could be the issue of best effort. I will do best effort to inform the consumers that the controller, the processor has, the controller has changed. Sorry, I read processor, but the controller has changed, and therefore I will do the best effort. So just to point out that we could have some solutions to make database transferable, which is naturally very optimistic. A few, and I'll just finish here, a few sort of provocations, but this is, I know that Alberto invited me here. This is why generally people invite me here. So these are the notions. So that is obviously the Homo Bruxelliensis, and so he's a new sort of individual who he still lives there. I mean, he was there 20,000 years ago and is there and is still there. Now, obviously it's a provocation. First of all, this idea that GDPR, data protection, is a sort of a religion. It's a Sharia. So obviously it's Sharia, and obviously when how can law somehow have the best over divine rules? I mean, anybody of us who has studied a little bit of canon law, there's Canon 1290 that says, well, when it comes to contracts, well, we follow civil law of the country, provided it's not against divine rules. So it's substantially it's Sharia. And obviously the data protection authorities are the ulemas who say what you can do. Well, the data protection supervisory board, the European Data Protection Supervisor, or the two things in Brussels, and the 27 DPAs are the ulemas. Then there is this element, this idea of rhetoric of personal data as an inalienable right. It is not that. I mean, I refer to my distinguished colleague that most of the speakers know very well, Giorgio Resta, in his book on transferability, commodification of personality rights. So it's obviously I cannot sell my name. Obviously I cannot say I'm selling, he wants to be called Vincenzo Zenozenkovic. Although now with all this BS about gender, one could change one's surname about one's first name. But anyhow, but I can authorize him to use it. So it's use. It's not, you can consent, license, whatever. I can consent to the use of my individual features, my name, my image, and other aspects. And if I may use, because I take the advantage of having such distinguished German panelists, so this quotation was somehow obliged with the Beruf, and so if there's a Beruf, or mostly, I mean, you are the successors and the heirs to von Savigny, the issue is avoiding that these century-old forests of private law and these very old trees are uprooted in Brussels, just and put, and yeah, another citation for our German colleagues from von Kirschmann on the maculator. They just put it in the shredder and they're shredded off. So just to point out that if one does not react, and because, I mean, in Brussels, they do not know what private law is. They ignore private law. They think that everything is regulatory. And what is regulatory is disposable. So it's the same thing, whether it is, I mean, it is a sunset clause for regulation. They put a sunset clause on the BGB, on the Codice Civile, on the Code Napoleon. They put a sunset clause, and but we can get rid of it. So, or we, as scholars, we react and say, sorry very much, the issue of consent. I mean, they have created a notion of consent that is out of the history of private law. Consent in data protection is something which is somehow in Plato's hyper-Uranium. It's nowhere there. We've never seen that kind of consent that in 2,500 years, and now we have this consent quarreling with with contractual consent. So just to point out that these are some provocations, and just to point out that I don't see very much data markets and database markets in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vincenzo, for these provocations, and not only for offering license your name, even under Vincenza, but I stop this because there would be much more to say, but it's not my role here to say the much more. We are open for discussion, of course, contributions for all speakers. I repeat the invitation from yesterday that not only the first, second, and third row is invited to the discussion. Alberto has a microphone. Please feel warmly invited. I see, of course, someone in the first row. Rainer.
Well, I have only two questions. First of all, to the last contribution. Wonderful that you gave a provocation. That's why we hope that we should do in this Congress. But don't you think that the Sharia of the Western world are the fundamental rights? That the Constitution and the fundamental rights are something which is a basis since 300 years about of the French Revolution and so on. This epoch, which influences private law and which we have to take into account, and that in so far privacy is something which is based in the Western Sharia of the fundamental rights. And well, we as the private lawyers, we must take it into account. That's only one question. The other, and I want to come back to the first paper, I was it's a wonderful, you gave a wonderful reference to the Californian development and the Californian principle of a right or of choice, pay with money or data. Surely, and you mentioned it, the problem is the relation to price control, as Hans yesterday has mentioned. If you have this choice, you must have, in the case of the data, if you prefer data, the customer prefers data, you must evaluate the price and so on. And therefore I would like to encourage to go one step further and to give us some criteria based on economic analysis to calculate the appropriate price in case of dispute. Surely there will be no completely convincing solution, but do you think that economic analysis can give some hints in which direction we should go in this problem?
Well, perhaps it would be good to answer directly and at least address Vincenzo and Wolfgang.
Clearly it's how you see things. Surely fundamental rights are obviously very high level, but I think there's some difference between the 1789 Declaration or the preambles of the German or Italian Constitution, which are somehow a limited text. And when you said you have 200 recitals, 100 articles, plus all the annexes of the 680, 681, and so on, it becomes very, very complex. But I have a question. I'll take advantage. I have a question for Professor Kerber. I was though I'm asking you, don't you think that we could build the system like a classical two-sided market? Let's go back to the first elements. Live-to-air television. I was looking at television. I wasn't paying television. I was just, they were competing for eyeballs. So I was looking at TV. I wasn't paying anything. I was paying attention. My attention was sold to advertisers. So the audience, and we had some system by which I could know how many people were looking at that program, and this was sold to the audience. Now we have more sophisticated systems, but don't you think that really the market should be as a two-sided market? I am providing data to, or rather, Google is providing services, search services to me. I look at Google, and Google sells this, doesn't get anything from me, or rather gets the data, but really sells the data to the advertisers. So I would see the platform, the intermediary, Google, Facebook, and the data companies as intermediary. I mean, I just want you to know if you think that the two-sided market approach could make more sense in this, rather than looking only the relationship between me, I sell data to Google, and then Google who resells this aggregated data to the advertiser. Just as a question.
Thank you so much. This is a decisive question, how to calculate the value of the consumers. So, I mean, I assume that firms have some calculation methods for that. The problem is that I think there's not much transparency what Google is doing concretely with data, and I think they can measure something, how much they can make revenues and profits from certain kind of data. Yeah. You can think theoretically it's not so difficult. You can say, okay, what is the average costs, and you can think about the marginal costs and the average costs, and so I think therefore so I have not really looked very deep into these materials of this. Yeah, there are guidelines. They have started to do this. They have examples, but I have not really looked how they're doing it really. Yeah? And it's very clear this has to be developed. Yeah? And I think it's a good strategy of the Californian Data Protection Agency to say the firms should justify it. So the firms have to come up with information and make it plausible to the Data Protection Authority why this price might be okay. Yeah, so not the Data Protection Authority is doing this, but they have to justify it. And then the question is, how can they do it? And as far as I've understood, it's that they are making a regulation, not how the firms should do it, but what kind of methods the firms can use for justifying it. Yeah? And then I think this is an experimental process, and how to develop this step by step.
But do I understand right that you don't think that is a general value of consumer data, but this has to be determined in the specific relationship between this firm and its clients, as Fernando yesterday explained?
It certainly is, because if you give your data to a firm, then this is a kind of a licensing contract for a certain kind of purpose for a certain firm. And therefore, this value is a bilateral thing, and therefore it depends very much on the firm, on their business model, and depends very much what you can do otherwise with the data. And this, yeah, so it depends really on the legal requirements, but also on the contract itself. And therefore, this is not about the whole idea that we could generally, abstractly determine the consumer of value data. I think this is not what is, I think, possible, and this is also not what they are doing here. Yeah, that's the point. Thank you. With the two-sided markets, yes, this should be taken into account. If this is really relevant at the end, this depends also on network effects and other things. But this is certainly you get data, and then you are selling a service based on this data to another firm, then these markets are related to each other. Whether this leads really to the problem of two-sided or multi-sided platform markets, I'm not sure. This is not necessarily the case. Yeah?
There was a question from the floor. Sorry, I don't know your name. Could you perhaps... you will get the microphone.
Okay, sorry. Thank you very much. I had a question. There is this new definition of zero-party data. which differs from first-party data and all the others, the third-party data. So basically, zero-party data is what consumer actively gives to the data controller, while the first-party data is what the data controller receives automatically, and it's a passive role of the data subject. So I wanted to understand whether, in your opinion, there might be a different value of zero-party data and first-party data. As of what I have been reading, the concept here is that in the envisioning the getting rid of the cookies economies and the cookies as a way to control, to monitor individuals on the internet, the new relationship seems to move to the fact that there is a consciousness on the data subject of sharing data for having not money, so the value is not on a direct economic consideration, but on loyalty programs or a better service, as it has been mentioned many times, but in a more defined relationship.
Well, I'm wondering whom have you asked? It could be Fernando, I have a feeling, but I'm not so sure. Wolfgang, too?
Oh, please, Wolfgang, go ahead.
I am not so sure about the difference between actively and passively. But this is really such a big difference. So from an economic perspective, I don't see it so much. It depends very much what kind of choice architecture you have. I'm not sure whether there is so much difference about this.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, as Wolfgang was mentioning, active and passive depends on the choice architecture, depends on the default, and whether you're nudged or not towards one of the options. I think what is really important, but it's a complicated thing to do here. And obviously, the ideal is to really have sufficiently informed consent, whether you express that by, let's say, clicking explicitly or by not opting out. The problem here is really anticipating the ways in which the data that you provide, both passively and actively, in a given transaction can be used is really hard to predict. I mean, when I first started to read the papers about the auctions that Amazon and Google have for the space, I was really puzzled about, in a way, the information you provide, your past online history, is something that they can really use to really present to you the links that are more likely to generate revenue in ways that is hard to imagine in the first place when you consent. I think that's really, I mean, ideally we should all strive to have informed consumer consent. I think probably in reality it is utopian nowadays, but there are probably middle grounds that could be workable to some extent.
Thank you. Speaking of fundamental rights, there might be a fundamental right for coffee. We have two further speakers on the list, except myself. I put myself also on, but I withdraw. Martin and Dirk, perhaps we can first bundle questions, short questions, and then try to bundle answers. Martin.
Try to be brief. Thank you. Thank you for the really inspiring presentations. From a legal point of view, we are, to some extent, all of us in the way of thinking and also in the world, in the way we use notions, in particular sales law and property, etc., we are starting from a kind of sales paradigm in the legal sense. The idea that having assets transfer to us entitles us to do with the assets what we want to do, and that we are free to do with that. Many of the ideas in competition, etc., were developed when assets were competing on the market. And so I was a bit puzzled from the line in the Münster sheet of Wolfgang Kerber saying that competition for the data use would not work. I could easily accept that it is much more difficult because we are talking about objects of contracts which are much more complex, which are much more regulated, not necessarily by the state, but also by the contract, because they have to determine to which extent there is a use and how long, etc. So it's much more complex because I'm not able to simply refer to the contractual object. So is it really meant that it is not possible, and is that the reason that it is too complex? That's the core of it. And then coming to Fernando Gomez, I had a bit the impression that everything you said, we should, that you do not like all the restrictions from being no longer a sales market, but a use market. So how far is your critique on the rules a critique towards the business models of using instead of selling in the technical legal sense? And that brings me to my question to Vincenzo. Vincenzo, you refer to the old categories. You mentioned Savigny and the Beruf unserer Zeit, etc. But isn't that what we developed? So our starting point, isn't that the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution consequences law, referring to goods with exactly all these side conditions? I just could mention only some aspects of it. So isn't it necessary to rethink the categories in that respect?
Could you please pass the microphone to Dirk Staudenmayer?
Very great. I sit in the first row. I shouldn't go to another row, but I hope I can nevertheless ask my question. In the interest of time, I will not react to the provocation. I loved it. I would like to react and say something about how this developed and what it is really, and that we found a pragmatic approach of data, but I won't. But instead, a question for Fernando. I found your, well, having worked with you in the CISL expert group, I know how deep your reflections are and how well-founded it is. So I found it again really extremely interesting, for me eye-opening, because we in Brussels, we speak about the consumer pays with data and the consumer pays with time. And you pointed out that consumer paying with time is nothing else than indirect data monetization. I agree. Now, my question is, I found it brilliant how you drew the broad picture. What I would be interested from you there, is there a problem with the present situation or not? Perhaps one sentence to explain. Many services are only possible because of advertising. The main payment is advertising, and some services would not possible at all. Not only would be paid, they would not be possible at all. Many media are only possible because of advertising, and paid they would not survive. So, and consumers got accustomed to having everything free on the internet. Free in inverted commas, of course. Yeah, they pay with data, I know. But basically, so therefore, is there a problem? Or should we just continue with the present situation, basically? So that's my first question. My second question is a subsidiary question. If you see a problem, I think there is one, yeah? But that's the interest of all the underlying theme of the conference. So the consumer pays here indirectly with data and then gets exposed to advertising, which he or she may want or may not want. And I don't go into dark patterns of manipulation and so on, but if this is the consumer pays with data and then pays with the price that I'm exposed to something which I may not want. So therefore, if this is something If this is a problem, what should one do about it? I'm interested not only in your brilliant description and the helicopter view of the present situation, but I would be interested in your view, what should one do if somebody should do something? Thank you very much.
Well, who wants to start? Perhaps Fernando, directly.
I'll try to be brief, and to some extent the questions presented by or raised by Martin Schmidt-Kessel and Dick Staudenmayer, they're connected in at least as I've understood them. In the sense, many of the things I've tried to present do not involve a value judgment. So I'm not saying that the business model of Google or Amazon is worse or better than the business model of companies like were mentioned before, that an app producer gives for free the app, gets the data, and then sells the data to a larger potential user. I was just simply describing that data, if we think of uses of customer data by firms, nowadays, most of that use is not through direct data exchanges or data sales. So I'm not saying that one or the other is better or worse. In the end, I tried to mention some of the obstacles that make data trade difficult, especially in our kind of, let's say, easy scheme of exchange, which is product or service, in this case data, in exchange for a price. That is difficult because of a number of reasons. I'm not saying that if we eliminate some of those barriers or we improve the situation, one would expect that the direct trade in data will increase. I'm not saying that is good or bad compared to other ways to monetize data. As to the problem with existing situation, and again, I think that it's true that, and it's part of, I mean, even those more ardent defenders of privacy and data protection really understand that without some usage of data by firms, a lot of valuable services that we are used to, especially in the online world, would not be feasible, or would be feasible against payment of significant amounts of money, at least in the aggregate. What I wanted to say about Google or Amazon and so on, is that targeted advertising as such is not a problem. If the only issue is that, well, you have to get advertising, as we had that before, when there was television in the old times, that was advertising, but it was untargeted, or targeted in a very rough way, just by, I don't know, at night there were no advertisements for kids, because kids were not supposed to be watching TV at night, but it was very rough. Now we can target it much more closely to the preferences. That would be superb. I prefer to if I have to watch advertisements or see advertisements on my screen, I prefer them to be targeted than targeted, because the targeted ones are typically more connected to my previous online activity, and therefore are things that I like or are more interested in. The issue is that it's not simply targeted advertising. Behind targeted advertising, it's a way to really exploit your willingness to pay. And therefore, you don't watch a certain ad on your screen because it's similar to your prior purchase history. It's because AI is predicting that these are the ones that you are more likely to click upon and more likely to spend money on. And that is a little bit more problematic. It's not simply targeted advertising. We use the term targeted advertising, but it's smart targeted advertising or profit maximizing targeted advertising, which again, I'm not necessarily saying this is bad in general, or it should be.
Neuro.
Yeah, well, well, perhaps we haven't reached that yet to some extent, but so I think that we should be aware of that. And I say, if it were pure targeted advertising, that would be great, but it's not just pure targeted advertising. There is a business model behind, and that's the reason why Google and Amazon are worth so much. It's because they obtain a lot of money out of this. It's not just simply a targeted advertising agency. It's targeted advertising that is able to leverage on their huge amount of data to have artificial intelligence that maximize the revenue from that advertising, and maximizes that in a very, let's say, direct way. Much more direct than advertising in the past, even targeted advertising in previous times. Is there something we may do? Well, probably yes. I'm not saying that this necessarily we have to do it through rules on data protection. Perhaps it is the level of consumer protection we have, the one that we have to, it's that lever that the one that we have to use. I come more from the contract consumer law side than from the data protection side, so all my sympathies are with contract and consumer protection and not so much with data protection. So probably those instruments could be explored in ways to improve ultimate consumer welfare there. But first we need to be aware that some of those ways to monetize are, I'm not saying that they're worse than others, but they are perhaps a little bit more problematic than what they look like just when we call it targeted advertising.
Vincenzo, do you want to continue?
Yes, just to Martin Schmidt-Seelzel. Surely things have changed and the economy has changed, and we're no longer in the Industrial Revolution. We have shifted from property and the main contract, which was contract of sale. We have moved to forms of entitlement and much less to contract of sale, but rather contracts in which you use objects. First of all, just let's think of car sharing and bike sharing. That's an example. Let's take the first contracts of Tesla. You didn't buy a Tesla. You were just renting a Tesla from Mr. Elon Musk, and you only had. And as a matter of fact, you were renting the body of the car while the computer and all the data were held by Tesla. So surely there are significant changes. But these changes can be sort of faced with classical instruments of private law without having some Frankenstein model coming up out of Brussels. I mean, the consent, I think the issue of consent is something between theology and Frankenstein, somewhere in between. I have just one add, if I may, just add one thing, and I'll close here, to Fernando Gomez. The issue of zero price and so on. Now, there's one aspect that at least I feel that has not been, I try to follow not all the economic literature on the point, which is somehow ignored, is the fact that data, not only data, public data, not rivals and all those things there. The point is that we, in this in this room, from a data perspective, are probably richer than an Arabian prince. Why? Because we can give our data, we can spend, if data is money, we can spend this money with, how many apps do you have on your mobile phone? I mean, is it a problem to have, it's only a problem of space. You don't have any more space to put that app on the thing. But you can spend all this data, your personal data, you can spend it not only once, but you can spend it 1,000 of times. It doesn't lose value. It isn't that there's a contract by saying, Fernando Gomez, you will give this data only to Google. You will not give it to Meta. No, you give it to Google, Meta, Twitter, and so on. So this is a fact that should be considered in the system. The fact that consumers, users, have unlimited possibility of expenditure, which is only, then you obviously have to see what is, are you interested? But so many people just download an app, maybe they don't use it. It doesn't cost anything. So just to point out that data is something that in our economy is, we can spend all the thing, it has nothing to do with our level of, and as a matter of fact, our data is much more valuable than Arabian Prince. I mean, we common people, it's much more valuable than someone who is not going to be targeted by advertising. Just to point out that I think this is an aspect that should be considered when we look at the source of the data, not once the data is being put in the system and can be, it's on rivals and so on.
Very happy that I'm not richer anymore than you, as I was yesterday, but Wolfgang.
Yeah, perhaps, so first I would like to support very much the argumentation of Fernando, and that we really have to understand that giving data to someone else, you might have advantages, but they can use it for all kinds of things. And I think behavioral manipulation, I think, is a problem behind this, and then it's negative for me. So this data is not only something which is positive always, and we should not have really slide into this fallacy of as much data as possible. That's always good. That isn't. And this we have to understand because it has distributional consequences. This is exactly what's behind behavioral manipulation, and therefore we have to be a bit more cautious about this. But I would mostly answer to your question, and try to explain it again. So there was for a long time with privacy, there was the idea that if we have competition between firms, then this would lead to a higher privacy level. Yeah, because then users would really identify who offers better data protection and takes less data, and then the normal competition process would lead to a rising privacy level. This was for a long time the idea. But it does not work in that way. I do not say it cannot work, because the point is we have competition on the market. Yeah, this is important. But if you look at competition economics, and you see you can do competition with different parameters. You can do it with price, with higher quality, yeah, with more product variety or innovation. And one of these parameters is a data use contract. Yeah? And the point is that, for example, competition law does not require that firms compete on all parameters. Not at all. So if there are certain parameters where they don't compete, it's not a problem for competition law. Yeah? But, and this is in that case, the problem is that through the information behavior problems and the asymmetry and intransparency, the users cannot identify who has a better privacy level. Yeah? And especially whether it's aligned to my specific preferences about this. Yeah? And therefore they cannot, and then you get a normal adverse selection effect, information asymmetry, and this leads then really to the problem that low quality survives in the market, and if someone wants to offer something better, then this firm has not really a chance because the users don't understand it and cannot identify them and reward this firm. That's the problem. So one market failure leads to the problem that competition does not work with this parameter, and this is my point in that respect. Now, when if there are, in speaking what we can do, if we are successful with consumer protection to solve this one market failure, yeah, then we can perhaps try to deal with this. But this is a question whether giving more information is really the solution, and this is, we know this is not certainly the point. Yeah, there was the idea using PIMs or otherwise. Yeah, that's my argument in that respect. Thanks.
Thank you so much, all the speakers, all the speakers from the room, and it's particular for this feeling of unlimited wealth, not only in data, but also in ideas, knowledge, wisdom, academia. Therefore, I think we owe a warm applause to everyone. But before we do that, we have a very important information on unlimited coffee, nearly unlimited coffee. The time is less limited than we thought. We are allowed to have coffee until 11:45, and it is not unlimited, but certainly enough. Thank you so much. That was a real pleasure. By the way, why is it no problem to sell the company which holds the data?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us again after the coffee break. Now we're coming to the panel discussion. The idea is here we have 5 panelists, and we will discuss the fundamental question: should the EU regulate the fair share of consumers in the use of the data? It can't be more fundamental than this. But basically, we have here 2 groups of panelists. We have 2 representatives who bring us a very technical, precise input, and then we have the 3 chairs of the 3 sections. So the way I wanted to structure the discussion is I will first ask Mr. Mattioli and Mr. Rossi-Chauvenet 2 precise questions, and then I will turn to the 3 sections or chairs of the discussions which we had so far and ask them also 1 question. The idea afterwards is then we turn to you. And I have asked the panelists to stick them to 2 to 3 minutes in their answers to the first question. So we have roughly 15 minutes of first interventions by the panelists, and then we can come to you. So you can use the time to think about what your questions, your contributions to this subject will be, and it would be very nice if we have a discussion with the audience. And we will try to reserve time for that. Okay, good, excellent. I take no objection as agreeing with this approach. So let's start. So I will then turn first to Mr. Rossi-Chauvenet, and I will be even more rigorous than Hans Schulte-Nölke in the previous, in the previous section. I will not introduce the panelists at all. I will just simply give them the floor, basically, so that all of this in the interest of saving time and having discussion time with you. So my first question to Mr. Rossi-Chauvenet would be about synthetic data generation, because he will speak about synthetic data generation, and the reason why he is there is this could be a way to avoid the whole problem we were discussing for 1 day, 1.5 days so far. And therefore, I would like to mention to him that indeed synthetic data generation is now for the first time mentioned in the AI Act in recital 111. I know it hasn't been formally adopted yet, but there's a text different versions of text circulating in Brussels. And what from my layman's understanding, I understand is that synthetic data is artificial data. It's created by AI, and the advantage is that it has the same statistical properties as personal data, but it does not contain personal data. And therefore, it can be used for data analysis, even if it's not linked to a data subject. And I understand from previous exchanges which we had that you see this as also ensuring compliance with GDPR and in general data protection requirements. So I would like to ask you, Mr. Rossi-Chauvenet, first to introduce briefly the subject of what is this thing, what is this beast, synthetic data, and then secondly, explain to us whether you think that this avoids the question underlying the whole conference, or in other terms, should even with synthetic data, the consumer still receive a fair share of compensation for the personal data used to generate synthetic data? The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Synthetic data is artificial data generated from original personal data, in the case we are here, and is trained to reproduce the characteristic and structure of the original data. So basically, we have artificial intelligence that is used to anonymize data, because the artificial data that are generated can reproduce the same statistics inference of the original ones. Are they accurate? Are they able to effectively consider it to be anonymized data and therefore not subject to GDPR? It depends. It depends on the way you generate this data. But according to my experience, I'm working with some of the leading companies in this sector at the moment. The possibility to use this privacy-enhancing technology to overcome the problem of having to choose between privacy on one end and utility of the data in a case of reuse of this information seems to be very promising. And the fact that the AI Act, it has been mentioned expressly synthetic data in two articles, in Article 10 and Article 59, as a specific way to actually a default rule for anonymizing information and using that information as training data for algorithm. It's really interesting because apparently it's the way to resolve the problem of having a large, sufficient large amount of data to train algorithms and therefore to develop AI. And since I think I have just a few more seconds, why it is so important also on the side of consumer protection and the reuse of consumer data. My feeling is that consumers should not be considered for the direct monetization of their data. The surveillance capitalism business model, as we know, is moving, is changing as far as even Google and Microsoft are considering with a new way of monetizing data, with getting rid of the the profiling of individuals from cradle to the thumb. So with synthetic data, the idea is that you organize, you study by cohorts an individual that is browsing, for example, the internet, and associate that individual to a category of individuals, but for a very limited period of time. The usage of synthetic data for defining new smart services are immense, are significant. For example, for medical research, what has been trained by hospitals in the Netherlands and also in Italy, there are some very recent researchers, is that by anonymizing this information, you can collect a large amount of data that can be used to train algorithms in the medical research. So I see that this trade-off may be, thanks to this technological development, being overcome, and there could be new chances to protect the consumers on one end, and on the other end to develop new products and services that are smart. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for sticking to the time. Now the next question would go to Mr. Mattioli. Here to say that the Data Act tries, endeavors to create a balance between the interests of the data holders on one hand and the data users and the third-party recipients on the other hand. So while the user who co-generates data should get a fair share of the data value, of the added value, and the data recipient, or simply another party who is a data have-not, would get access to data to use it for innovative business models. On the other hand, the Data Act also tries to protect the interests of the data haves, the data holders. And the Data Act wants to keep an incentive for them to collect data, because it's like inventors or artists. If you don't give an incentive to the data holders to collect data, they won't collect data, and that for the economy would be really bad. So basically, an incentive needs to be given. So if one speaks about giving the consumer as the user a fair share of the data value, one needs to keep in mind that data holders need to keep an incentive. Now, we have invited Mr. Mattioli to the panel because I understand that you work in a co-location company, providing to your customers power, cooling, connectivity, and physical security, while your customers, platforms for instance, or cloud service providers, provide hosting or cloud services. So if we speak in this conference about what kind of fair share of compensation the consumer should receive for giving access to personal data, other investment costs of data holders getting commercial benefit out of data should also be part of that equation. So while it is your customers who manage and store data, you probably have a good overview of the relevant costs. So could you explain to us, please, how do you see the share of investment costs of data holders, other than for purely assembling consumer data, in the overall costs of data holders, which need to be amortized, because if they are not, then they lose the incentive? And how do you see the development of those costs in the future? Please, the floor is yours.
Good morning to everyone. First thing I would like to say, data is energy. Energy is a cost. And then the data need to be stored somewhere. Normally, the data at the end of this process is stored in a data center. The data centers and the new data centers are really capital intensive when you have to build. Just to give you an idea. A data center cost is based on the megawatt of IT load he may provide to customers. In a few words, can go from 16 million for a megawatt, go down to 8 million for a megawatt, depends on the type of the data center I'm going to build. In a few words, the new data centers are, especially for AI purpose, will be 100 megawatt. So that means they will cost roughly 1 billion. You have to think, for example, as well, that when you just download a picture, you're consuming data, 0.13 watt hours. But the problem, worldwide, we are downloading something like 3 billion pictures every day. That means in a year, you're going to spend something like, only for picture, something like 32 million euro. And just talking about downloading pictures. Let's think about if you're going to download videos. There are even 1,000 more, you need 1,000 more memory to store them and to move them. Okay. Just put on the table other numbers. We are 8 billion 300 million all over the world. 66.1% is using internet. So can you imagine what is the volume of data we are exchanging every day? And can you imagine that this data need to be stored somewhere? And it is not coming for free. The investor already told you about the investment in the data center arena, but we have to add the server, we have to add the networks, and so on. So it's a huge investment. Normally, the return of investment of these services is 10 years. And the company not willing to stay out for so long time. So my idea is, obviously, data is a cost for a company. Data need to be transmitted. And just to give you, just a few days ago, I was looking for about the global trends from the 2015 to the 2022. The internet user were 3 billion in the 2015, and in 2022 they were 5.3 billion, a growth of 78%. The internet traffic from 0.6 zettabyte rose up to 4.4 zettabyte. That means 600% increase. Then there is the power costs. Luckily, the technical aspect is helping us. We increase the use of the data, but the cost of the energy stay almost the same. It's increasing, but 70%. That's not so much in any case. Crypto is impressive. It's passed from the 4 terawatt in 2015 up to 150 terawatt that's in the 2022. That means 2,300 grow. So just to give you an idea, that's what the data is moving around. In this case, crypto mining is not data, it's only belong to himself and is using a lot of power. As well, the data transmission network using power, the same power that we're using to elaborate the data. So at the end of the story, as soon as you do something, take a picture, send it to a cloud services, you pay money, it costs money. Someone need to take this cost back. That's almost the idea. What else can I say? Obviously, the data center are growing so much because we are waiting for the AI. AI will come, it will be a big game changer for the future. How it will be? Just to give you an idea, if you do a search in one Google asking for any query, and then you do the same thing on a ChatGPT, for example, it will take 3 times more energy. This energy needs to be found, and energy is a cost. Someone has to pay for this. And unfortunately, that's maybe, we take a little bit time to give back the money to the final user of the data. So that is the idea. That's what I would like to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also thanks a lot to you for sticking to the time. So now I will then pass a question to the 3 presidents of the 3 sections, and I will do it in the chronological order, so I'll start with André. So basically, we have learned from section 1 that efficient management of giving and withdrawing consent is key. That was for me one of the key sentences also of section 1. And we have in both sections 1 and 2 a shared understanding that consent under Article 6.1a GDPR is the, not only, well, in practice at least, the legal base. And while the modalities of the data access, use, and data sharing are regulated by the contracts in the different contractual relationships, data holder user, data user, third-party recipient, data holder, which are regulated in the Data Act. We've also established yesterday in section 2 that price regulation is not a new thing. I always like to hear that, actually. So also in the past, courts struggled with price regulation under different angles, of course. Now they will have to struggle with what reasonable compensation in Article 9 will be. But what the Data Act did not do is, and intentionally not do, is to regulate the relationship between the data holder and the consumer user who grants access to personal data to the data holder in the future data sharing contract or data access, data use contracts to be concluded under the Data Act, which enables then the data holder to use these data and which enables the data holder to pass them on, always provided that there is a legal base under the GDPR. And the question, therefore, which I would like to know an answer from the 3 panelists is, should therefore, given that the Data Act does not regulate this, should the EU therefore regulate, as the name of our panel is, the fair share of consumers in the use of their data? And if so, how, in which form, in which design, to which amount, etc. So that's the question. It's intentionally also a question which is generally phrased so that we can have a discussion with you, the audience, after the 3 chairs of the 3 sections gave their answers. So please, André, floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. So I have 2 minutes. That's not very easy to answer the questions. And I would like to, as Rainer said yesterday, that we should also address and invite also everybody to think and to ask questions. So maybe a very broad overview. So imagine that every time a data holder is using your data, that you get a remuneration. And at first sight, wouldn't that be great? I mean, it would give us a fair share of the use of data, and our data could not be exploited by companies free of charge. So the overall idea to give consumer users a fair share compensation for the use of his data is at theoretical level very intriguing. But what are the challenges? We all learned in the last 2 days there are, of course, challenges, and I would like to present some in a nutshell, and that might be the base for later discussions. What we identified, of course, the first thing is the evaluation of personal data. That was always the entire time a topic. So how much, what is it worth? You know, there is no price tag on it. And this is something, so if the EU wants to regulate it, I believe it has to say something about how to put a price tag on data. And that's going to be devilishly difficult. And also, and I was asking myself, well, do we as consumers know at all who are all the data holders? Honestly speaking, I don't know who has all my data. I'm very honest. Second question is, well, how should the consumer receive his remuneration from the data holder, and in what form? You know, just very practically, how does that work in practice? I was asking this myself. First challenge, and that was already something which already slightly was mentioned. Well, the remuneration and maybe would lead to increased costs for companies, and that could lead to higher prices for consumers because they have to pay the remuneration and also extra overheads because they have to distribute the remuneration somehow. So would that lead to higher prices, and then at the end the consumer does not gain anything? Of course, this is always said by companies, and I understand that. And then there was also the question with the incentives. So would we take away all the incentives from companies to collect data at all? The last thing is, do we at the end create a system the consumer is not really interested in? And I was asking this myself, but this was a discussion yesterday. So how much money are we talking about for an individual consumer? So probably in most of the cases, just a few euros. Martin made an example yesterday where I thought, yes, it might be different, but probably it's a few euros. So there is a rational apathy on the side of the consumer. So I would never go to anybody for a few bucks. So then we need to find then we need to use or find instruments to overcome this rational apathy, because otherwise we will just create more law in the books, and this is something we don't want. And this is not impossible, but to overcome rational apathy is in my opinion, that's quite hard to find. So to conclude very shortly, the idea of a fair data usage compensation is intriguing, but there are several very severe questions to be answered before. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, maybe I can just take up with what you said, or maybe go one step back, because I think it's interesting to clarify that maybe behind your question or behind the whole conference and behind the aim of the Data Act, there are at least two different aims, so to speak. The first one is it's all about efficiency, better data use, better data allocation. The other one is distributional justice, fair reward. And we have to ask the key question whether which one is more important, if we can combine it, but at least we should keep them separate. As a direct answer to your question, should we, instead of waiting and seeing how the Data Act might work, go ahead and directly introduce new additional regulation to ensure fairness? I tend to say, let's wait and see how the Data Act works out. The reason for that is that I come from the point that the Data Act might, in the end, and I will say some more words about it, lead to some functioning data markets, also with consumers as users. Might, and we shall see. We have heard all throughout the conferences some aspects which might help. We have heard about personal information management systems. We have heard about intermediaries who may play a role. We have heard about model contracts, model contractual rules, contract types. But of course, all these helpful instruments come with a but. For instance, when we talk about the contract types, we see that still there is not much clarity about the involved interests, which underlie the types, who is acting in whose interest, what Martin Schmidt-Kessel pointed out. We are not certain about the role that intermediaries might play. I argue that the rights of the user might be freely traded downwards, even through several players, and that might enable intermediaries, but we have to see. We're not certain how helpful PIMs might be in the end, or whether we have to resort to smart contracts, even what Teresa pointed out. So all these instruments are interesting, might come, there is a but, and we shall see how it works or not. Strong arguments against the possible functioning of such markets were then given by the economists, both of you. Wolfgang, basically that was your argument, that you say, you think direct regulation is necessary. The market will not work in the end, and especially not if we talk about consumers. Fernando showed us the whole picture, how complicated data markets are in many, many aspects. And there are no simple solution to all that. The aspect that impressed me most is all these externalities and difficulty to ascertain the externalities, be it for business, small business, be it for consumers. And I think that's the key reason why so far we do not have functioning markets. As Wolfgang pointed out, you talked about IoT devices market, but the combined data markets as well. And we wouldn't need the Data Act if these markets were working, and that's also the assumption of the Data Act, as you pointed out. And I think one of the reasons is that all these potential externalities are so fiendishly difficult to ascertain. If I'm a small business and hand out my data, it's quite difficult to establish for the future where I might end up, which kind of secrets I might reveal. Same for consumers, where we heard yesterday all the problems when the data end up in the wrong people's hand. And at the same time, talking about the value, they have potentially a very small value, so why bother? And that brings us to the key question. Maybe regulation is necessary, we shall see. There are already some thoughts about it. Think about the European health data space. That would be exactly the opposite system, forcing the people to surrender the data. But, and that brings me back to the very first question, with the European health data space, there is no remuneration at all, no fair share at all. So is that a good idea? And that, then of course we can think about collecting societies as a model, an age-old idea when we talk about data. And we have heard collecting societies, they would then have the task to value the data, which, and we have heard that already, is so difficult. So I have no clear solution. I definitely tend to wait and see and look whether some markets develop under the existing system.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, yesterday we learned that the development is pay or okay, which means that the consumer pays to the business. We are now speaking about the opposite direction. We could call this pay for, okay, and that needs to be contemplated a little bit. Let's start with the Data Act and the consumer user. One could, of course, envisage that there is a friend obligation if the user is a consumer, also regarding compensation for agreeing or for consent, or perhaps for not withdrawing, which would mean like an insurance company. If you don't cause any damage, you get a refund. That's feasible, and I think one should go this road, but not broadly, but only for sectors, and one of the ideal test sectors could be cars. Second point, perhaps other instrument, GDPR, same idea, whether, for example, for social media, a sort of, let's say, not refund, but compensation for not having withdrawn is at least imaginable for consumers using them. My initial idea would be not directly regulate, first of all monitor, much closer monitoring of, let's say, the value sharing of companies in such situations, the Data Act situations and GDPR situations. Perhaps we need another observatory on data sharing, which also identifies best practices, for example, of certain industries and certain sectors, and sometimes sunlight is the best disinfectant. Perhaps it helps a little bit to make things aware, and perhaps also one could encourage, let's say, policies of businesses without regulation to grant such refunds, which then would more or less give consent a price, or give the contract under Data Act a price, and the consumer knows I'm getting paid for my consent, even if the refund is very low. And of course there is an option to donate it to charity anyway, because you don't want to have a few bucks, but putting a price tag on it is perhaps the right way forward. Therefore, I very much like this idea of much closer monitoring, inspiring for actors to deliberately put a price tag on and offer refunds to their customers, consumers who do not withdraw their consent under data protection regulation, and who conclude such contracts under Data Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for sticking to the time limits. So now I would like to pass the floor to the audience. If you have any questions or any comments, so you can ask any of the panelists a question, but I very much strongly encourage you to also put in your comments or your answer to the question, which I generally kept very general. So now the floor is yours. Can I also ask you, for those who take the floor, please to, thank you very much for passing around the micro. Can I also ask you to, when you speak, please quickly, some of you may have spoken, but nevertheless, please mention quickly your name so that everybody knows. Please.
Institute of Technology, and my question would be to understand more about synthetic data, because I can see the point that you say it's no longer personal data and nevertheless has the value for those companies who do research in medicine, for example. But then, as we heard and Fernando stressed yesterday and today as well, most of the data seems to be valuable as soon as you connect that data again to another patient. It might not be the patient that can be detected in the data, but nevertheless, once you find a certain illness and it is for a certain patient, then you want to relink it to a natural person, and that's when it becomes personal data again. So my question for you would be whether you see this real value in simply analyzing synthetic data, or does the added value in the end come in once you relink it to individual patients, because they might have this illness, for example, even though they were not in the data set. So this difference between having synthetic data with its own value and then actually adding value by relinking it to individual patients or natural persons in general.
So, thank you for the question. The idea behind synthetic data is to have secure, anonymized data. So it's not anymore possible to go back to the original record. So you have an ensemble of records. Each one is created, is generated by artificial intelligence. The whole group ensemble represents correctly, and that is a matter of accuracy, the original data set. And this is the reason why they have a value which is much higher than the data that is produced by other kind of anonymization techniques like generalization, randomization, which have been used so far. Because the aggregation of those data reduce the quality and the utility. So the utility remains high, and for this reason it's interesting for pharmaceutical companies, also not only on the research related to the development of a drug, but also the economic analysis behind a disease. For example, one thing that has been that is currently being evaluated is to use all the data of a region in Italy, healthcare data, to be synthesized and made them available for the private sectors to develop tools for the government of the territory, so to analyzing some behaviors on the territory that would not be possible if to be shared would be the personal data. So in this respect, I see the possibility of giving a value to the consumer, to the user, in terms of new kind of services that are more that are better related to their needs, instead of just trading and selling their single personal data.
Grazie. Thank you. Hi, I'm Antonio Davola. I'm assistant professor at the University of Bari Aldo Moro. I actually had a question which is marginal about synthetic data, and then a question for the whole panel more generally. So first and foremost, as far as I understood, and I'm not an expert in the topic, synthetic data sets are created from personal data at the very beginning, at the very early stage. And according to my perspective, this constitutes data processing. So the creation of a synthetic data set per se is data processing, and therefore is subject to all the requirements that the GDPR establishes for data processing, including purpose limitation, data minimization, and aware consent by users. So my point is, if this creates a clash with the GDPR in the sense that we should ask data subjects consent, and implying that this consent is aware regarding the fact that their personal data will not be personal data anymore, and therefore they will structurally lose control on them, because the data subject will not be able to activate all those rights the subjects are provided with regards to personal data, so access, erasure. So I was wondering whether we can consider that an actual aware consent under the GDPR. And this was a more general question for the panel. So whether, from the industry, we see kind of a tendency towards solutions, technological solutions, that detach the data from the person it refers to fully anonymize data according to different techniques. So my point is this approach structurally compatible with the attempt to providing consumers a fair share regarding the usage of their data, or are they supposed to clash with other solutions? Because in my opinion, the very own idea of fairness in the share implies some sort of equivalence between the usage of the personal data and what the consumer receives. But if we entirely lose track of how those data have been using, even through synthetic data sets and so far and so on, this means that what we can compensate is only the first provision of those data, so the very first moment in which that data is provided. So my point is, so it's not fair. It's just a general compensation that we can agree on for a first usage, kind of agreeing that then those data are out there and the consumer is not able to get a fair share anymore. So is there kind of a trade-off that we can figure out or not?
Thank you very much. Anybody of the panel who would like to react to that?
Yeah, on synthetic data, for sure. So, anonymization is processing. So, you need to have prior notice. You need to have a legal ground for processing. That might be the compatibility test according to 6.4 of GDPR. So, not necessarily as an express consent on the anonymization. I think that the idea of reuse of data that are not anymore personal data but becomes non-personal data, it's a good way to find a mediation between the need to have smart services that needs data from different places. This is behind the digital strategy of the European Union. This is the idea of European data spaces. This is the idea behind that intermediary. So we need to have data that are shareable. To advance a potential solution is to possibly to have what we have already in some other sectors of law. So a social license over that ensemble of data that have been grouped from different data controller. So far, what we have accepted is that there is a large data controllers in the US that have all our data that we give it for free. Here, there might be a solution, there might be an alternative, which is sharing in between the European space, economic space, non-personal data that have been accurately anonymized, that are useful, and probably they can be remunerative for the users in terms of services.
I'd just like to add from the lawyer's perspective, there is a proposal on the table, I think it's quite old, by Luisa Specht-Riemenschneider, who argued that you might introduce an exception for data protection if you anonymize very close to the source, similar to the copyright provisions, who have such a thing for intermittent technical copies who only have a short existence, so to speak. And she said maybe we have to introduce something like that in data protection law, data privacy law. And that would exactly address your question. Your second question is, does anonymization necessarily mean that you do not get a fair share? Well, certainly it means that you generalize the value and that you no longer can tailor it to the semantic content. That's true. But nevertheless, it could be fair enough if you generalize it. You see what I mean? Instead of getting nothing.
Thank you very much. Anybody else, please?
I do not really know to which I should direct that question, but we are switching every time between talking about personalized data, non-personalized data. Now we have cases where the status is changing, so it's not a stable status. I would like to add that it is also not an absolute one, it's a relative one. It could be that one data recipient becomes then the probably untechnically data holder of personal data, whereas earlier on the data had been non-personalized, in particular in the case mixing up synthetic data with personal data, then perhaps the personal data, the synthetic data become personal data by being personalized. That leads for the discussions we have here on fair data share, as important as the difference between personalized and non-personalized is, that brings me to the question, so should the rules on fair share be basically identical? Because we could not really forecast in many cases whether data are personalized or not, or whether they become personalized or not. Or should we stick to separate regimes with all the questions of switching all the time, perhaps even switching back to anonymized situations? And if not, what should be the model? Which one of the two should be the model for regulating? Sorry, probably it's more to the lawyers, but it could also be an economic question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Who would like to respond?
Yeah, of course. The very first question, if you ask about fair remuneration, is who should get the remuneration, and that's exactly your point. I take it from the DA. They have taken the standpoint that first ownership for the user is a fair idea, so that is at least the solution for non-personal data. And if we come to personal data, it's up for debate, because that's the idea of the Data Act, that we have the two regimes in parallel. And hopefully, but not always, as we all know, the person entitled under data privacy is the same as the user. It's very often not, exactly. And then this is only the starting point, whether fairness then means that both should get a share, yeah, and so on and so on. And let me add another thing. First ownership doesn't necessarily mean that you get a fair share. This is what I just said. It just means that you have a position you can bargain with, and if you get really something for it, that is the question of functioning markets. And it might work or might not work. And that brings us to a debate that I had with, or not a debate, we just talked about it with Wolfgang Kerbe, because from an efficiency point of view, we don't care who gets first ownership. That's Coase's theorem, so to speak. But from a distributional justice point of view, it makes a huge difference if you're the one who get it for free and can offer it. Yeah. So.
Thank you also for that question. I change it slightly because this might illustrate a little bit more. The question may also be, which kind of data, personal or non-personal, is more valuable than the other? And of course, the answer is, as lawyers always answer, it depends, but there are completely different scenarios imaginable. For example, in the main example I'm working on, the non-personal, the depersonalized data is much more valuable because it can be traded freely, and therefore businesses, in my example, the farming machinery industry puts an enormous effort in depersonalizing data for making it much more available, and they fear that someone comes along and pollutes them with personal data and therefore also decreases their value. And therefore, back to your question, I have a feeling that starting with the user and checking whether the user gets a fair share is perhaps a good starting point, although it's a starting point Dirk might dislike, because then we do not care much whether the user is a consumer or a data subject or not. But at least if the user is the key figure for more or less making data more valuable. That's the basic idea under the Data Act. Then why not starting with the user and then, of course, look closer at the different categories. If there's personal data in, there is sometimes the user himself, sometimes a different person, also the data subject, and see whether also their fair shares can be allotted. Therefore, start from the user and start at least from the probably in many cases of product-generated data, more valuable non-personal data. It's totally the opposite, not empowering consumers, but empowering markets.
You shouldn't so easily assume what Dirk likes or not, because I think that basically the work we're doing on the model contract terms are taking the user as a very central part. But I see that Teresa wants to come in. Perhaps she wants even to say something about the MCTs. And then there's another colleague at the end of us. Please, Teresa first.
Thank you very much. Teresa Rodriguez de las Heras Vallel from Carlos III University. I have a question about the synthetic data. I would like to understand what is the need of a link between a prior processing of personal data and then the synthetic data. So I would like to understand to which extent we can create synthetic data just by defining certain criteria or certain trend, without any prior set of data that are personal data. For example, can we say, I want to create synthetic data related to the tendency of the price in the market following the following criteria, or we always need a prior, there is always personal data duly processed, and then we have synthetic data? That is my first question, if I may stop here.
So you can have synthetic data that are derived from non-personal data, but in any case you need data to train the algorithm to be able to generate. So it's not just putting some criteria, but for example, synthetic data are used to train autonomous vehicles.
Exactly.
So instead of having real situations, you use computer to generate potential accidents or issues. So,
so you can train AI with synthetic data that will generate more synthetic data and so on. So we can't recreate
so the problem that may arise is the hallucination because of the training on synthetic data that are not correct, that are not accurate, that do not represent reality. So that is the problem. And some are already talking about not just synthetic data, but synthetic programs. So AI that is creating softwares, that is creating other software and solutions.
Thank you. If I may just very briefly, my second point is to insist on this idea, and I would like, of course, to share with the panel, this idea that in the case of a smart product, all the data that are essentially product-related data, they are, in most of the cases, I insist that is a personal opinion, in most of the cases they are non-personal data, at least from the perspective of the data holder. But essentially they are co-generated data. And I insist on this idea because when you buy the smart product, certainly you pay for that functionality. That is certainly true. But you are paying for a functionality that is going to provide data, collect data, or generate data that are going to be valuable for both parties. Probably as a user, I want to have that data personalized because I want to use it for a very sophisticated maintenance service. But from the perspective of the provider, the manufacturer, the idea is that they are collecting data that are related to the product itself. It's completely relevant if the product is used by me or is used by somebody else. The key issue is this product consuming too much energy during the night? When it's off, when it's on? This is the kind of information that data holders need. And for me, that is essentially co-generated data, and I perfectly understand that data holder, in this case manufacturer, would like to have certain level of control. Otherwise, we are disincentivizing the producing of a smart product, because they produce a smart product essentially because they can collect this kind of non-personalized data to a certain extent. That I would like to double check with you this statement. Thank you so much.
Okay, I abuse my role as chair to just quickly respond to that, but then I pass it on to you, Flora. So basically, yeah, I understand from the point of view data holder, it may not matter if it's personal or non-personal data, but from the point of view of GDPR, as soon as a person uses the IoT device, it becomes personal data because it can be traced back to a specific person. So it depends on which angle you take. But having abused enough my position, I pass the micro on.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on this aspect of cogeneration. Basically, because I think that's an extremely interesting and important aspect, and I would argue maybe functioning markets, we do get a fair share for both of them. Yeah. So we have on the one hand the possibility for the user to trade his or her rights under the Data Act to the holder, and of course the holder sells the IoT device. That's basically, you can't separate the two. That's what Wolfgang said. I even went so far in the Münster colloquia that we had to say that we should think about a kind of partnership, and that's why I found so intriguing what Martin Schmidt-Kessel said, who simply inversed the role so that you should think about a kind of agency in the interest of the user. I argued rather in favor, and it's interesting, we all talk about contract types, yeah? I rather argued in favor of a kind of maybe even partnership contract, yeah, where the two code generators should somehow enter into an agreement how to make money with their data, yeah? And I see a huge chance with the model contractual roles, which now come up, to develop roles who might be based on this idea of joint ownership plus partner, we have joint ownership rules coming from the property rights theory, plus partnership ideas for the idea of how to collectively together make value, create value out of the data co-generated. But of course, and that's exactly what you said, we have to keep in mind that sometimes there's this third person, and that's the subject under the data privacy rules. Maybe we even have to think about partnership agreements between the three parties, if they are three parties. You see what I mean? Yeah,
May I have one question because you said something about the synthetic data, and you were telling something about hallucinations, right? And I was wondering, so how trustworthy are these synthetic data? You know, because if we all talk about hallucinating AI and ChatGPT and generative AI in general. So do they have? Are they as apparently they are not as trustworthy as other data? Is that correct, or is just that my misunderstanding? Sorry for abusing my.
No, okay. We don't even have a definition according to any law of synthetic data so far. So we are talking about a technology. So we need to have standards on that, and we have the possibility to, and I'm sure that the European Union will define more and more specifically with a specific regulation what the quality should be of synthetic data. We don't even have a threshold of anonymization so far, according to any rules, right? The Italian Data Protection Authorities mentioned the fact that there should be at least less than 1%, but it's so we need to have a standard on synthetic data for sure to understand the quality, and to do that you assess afterwards. You continuously compare what has been produced with the original data, and then you are able to identify whether the quality is there, so it can represent the original data set or it cannot represent. And that is fundamental in order to prevent hallucination. But it's the same thing of AI, because it is AI. It is data generated by AI.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, there was a colleague there, and I think if there's nobody else, because we have already gone beyond the timing. So, oh. Okay, good. Apparently Christian wants to come in too. So if there's nobody else, then I would then conclude the list, because we have already Admittedly, obviously, previous section took longer, so we have a little bit more time, but I don't want to cut too much into Alberto's conclusions, basically. So please, floor is yours, and then I'll pass the last word to Christian Twig-Flessner.
Thank you. Mariangela Balestra, lawyer in Bologna. I was participating in the ELI project on data, and where data cogeneration was created. But I have a provocation for all the panelists, because maybe it's important to know where is your perspective. A real case, a genomic company that collects genomic data and sell from people that want to know their health status. Okay, and they pay to receive this test from this company in UK. And this company uses this data to create other products, healthy products, food products. So, from your perspective, do you think that the improvement of products and services is sufficient as a consent? Do you think that they should receive, the consumer should receive a fair remuneration? Do you think that they should be considered co-generators of data, and that they should have a partnership contract, a special partnership contract with the company? Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody who wants to respond? Yeah? Okay.
I could at least, envision that they might be co-generators, and but that's exactly all this that shows that it's not such an easy task, yeah, to think about all this model situations. I'm very thankful for you that you mentioned the ELI project, which Teresa also mentioned yesterday, because to my knowledge, this project where you took part in was the first one to really flesh out in great detail how this idea of co-generation and contracts about co-generated data might work. I still think that's the important template to start from. Yeah, but honestly, I can't give you an exactly yes or no answer to your question. Sorry for that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. If none of the panelists wants to come in, I would like to thank all of those who participated in the debate. Oops, Christian, yes, of course. I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you very much. So a brief question by Christian Twig-Flessner, who is following us. So following in particular Anders' answer, if the value of data to a consumer is financially negligible, then is the value to a consumer the benefit of unpaid access to digital content or services? And rather than seeking a precise monetary amount, would it be preferable to limit this question to, is it sufficient value to establish contractual relations? And how do we recalibrate consumer rights to suit this type of arrangement? Didn't get the question?
Perhaps I can first of all repeat my idea of better monitoring. First of all, we will have to find out whether it's totally a few cents or pennies or less, and then of course financial remuneration makes nonsense. It is a balancing exercise, of course. Using seemingly free service and paying by data in this overall balancing exercise, also the value of the service. My GPS service needs to be taken into account. Only in cases where the value of the service received by the consumer is low and the value of the data is very high, much more worse than the service received, then this idea of giving the consumer a better share comes into play. And that's the reason why we need much more monitoring. There are some studies, but systematic monitoring of certain sectors, what is the value of data and whether is this added value distributed fairly is one of the tasks perhaps for the next years under the DA in particular.
Perhaps I'll add something myself to Christian. First of all, my understanding at least is we're not discussing the situation under the DCD. So we're not discussing the situation where on one hand there's a digital content or a digital service provided, and on the other hand, even if the DCD does not speak about counter-performance and in exchange of, there is in exchange of to the digital content, digital service data provided. That's not the situation, because here indeed there is the contractual equilibrium, there is a balance of performance and counter-performance, at least as a matter of principle, and so basically it should be fine. The question really is more about those situations where you are, for instance, the car example, you buy a car, you pay a price, you pay the same price as somebody who does not provide data, and then basically you don't get any price reduction, any additional service, anything, but you still provide an additional counter-performance on top of the money you would have paid for the car in any case. And obviously the question of the bundling, where you say IoT devices will increase a lot in the future, and where then the manufacturer designs the product in a way you can only use the product or use the product adequately if you provide data. And these are the questions we decide. And then indeed it would be a question how to redesign consumer law. Okay, I tried to answer that question of Christian. I presume there are no other points anymore. No, in this case, thank you very much. I would like to thank the panelists for their participation. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to all of you who participated in the debate. And I would like to pass the floor to Alberto for conclusions. Do you want to sit here? How do we do?
So thank you very much to all of you for this wonderful 2 days and for this panel, which was actually the perfect conclusion already of our conference. So I will be very brief and try not to stick between, to stand between you and the deserved lunch. So I just wanted to pick up some suggestions from our discussions. I will not go through the main achievements of the presentations and discussions, but just some additional ideas. So we discussed about the precise determination of the value of data, and we saw that this show significant methodological difficulties, and that is affecting many areas of civil law and intertwined legal areas. So for instance, the question when consumers demand a restitution of the value of data, the problem of extra-contractual liability, the problem regarding procedural law, and also collective judicial enforcement. Of course, we have other key issues with calculation of average processing costs, what kind of contract to foresee this monetization, the problem of price control in relation to general terms and conditions. For instance, the question, should we transfer common law concepts to consumer law? Very useful, the focus from a consumer common law perspective. And again, this morning we saw the role of the market, so to what extent the market mechanism should impact on the regulation of data. Again, shall we differentiate according to the type of data? Here, the normative assessment and economic analysis play a fundamental role, as we saw. And some lessons we learn, we find in the implementation of the digital content and the Sale of Goods Directive, and now together with the with the Data Act, this has triggered and intensified a lively discussion on the further development of contract theory in light of the changes caused by digitalization. In particular, we saw regarding the classification of contract types and the understanding of the contractual synalagma with regard to the role as a counter-performance. At present, however, we know that the status of such consideration differs sensibly between the member states. And specifically regards the monetization of consumer data, I wanted to pick up some experience from the member states we monitored in the work we coordinated together with Anna Schutz regarding the implementation in 27 member states. We saw that data as counter-performance as regulated in the Digital Content Directive, so that rule could also be substantially extended to many contracts of different kinds. And some courts in European member states already accepted that contracts between social network operators and consumers are onerous consumer contracts. Well, before the Digital Content Directive, this happened in France, for instance, and also in Italy. And an outstanding example of such extension is the establishment of the principle arising from the Digital Content Directive, so data as counter-performance, regarding the provision of data by the consumer in France. Indeed, since the implementation of the Digital Content Directive, the French Code de la Consommation contains provisions on such counter-performance in non-monetary form, also for contracts outside the scope of the Article 3 of the Digital Content Directive. May this be a model for a future update of the Sale of Goods Directive, as we are talking a lot of Internet of Things, of data and digital services intertwined with physical goods, generating and gathering data. Of course, we saw that a delicate issue in case of withdrawal of the consent of the processing of personal data regards the restitutions. And here the implementation of the DCD provides some interesting solutions. For instance, some EU member states explicitly regulated the contractual consequences of consumer withdrawal of consent to the processing of personal data. For instance, the Estonian legislator clarified that the withdrawal of consent by the consumer should not be considered a breach of contract and thus not entitle the trader to exercise any remedies against the consumer. And the same provision excludes the trader's claim for damages in case of withdrawal of consent. Worth mentioning is also the solution provided by the Greek legislator, according to which in case of termination of the contract, the value of the data provided by the consumer should be calculated and reimbursed. The problem of calculation of the value of personal data will also arise when the recipient chooses to invoke the right to ask for a proportionate reduction of the price. A further attempt to regulate this issue was made, but did not find concretization in the end by the Latvian legislator, and the later withdrawn proposal provided that if after the consent's withdrawal the consumer still uses digital content, but no longer wants to remunerate the trader with personal data, he assumes the duty to pay in money. So what about the calculation and clarification in advance of the value of personal data? Should we take this model also for updating the Sale of Goods Directive? So Andre Janssen rightly put an accent on the problem, on the need to fight the consumer apathy, so ensuring effective enforcement. And here the interplay with the acquis communautaire in terms of consumer protection and with the law on unfair commercial practices may be useful. For instance, Article 6 of the Consumer Rights Directive sets the information requirements for distance and off-premises contracts. And we know that one of these information duties covers the total price of goods and services and any other costs, including the total costs for billing period, and including the duty to disclose the manner in which the price is to be calculated. And after the Modernization Directive, the 6A, Article 6A of the CRD, sets additional specific requirements for contracts concluded in online marketplaces. Of course, all is intertwined with Article 8 of the Consumer Rights Directive, the so-called button solution for internet cost traps, according to which, keeping it briefly, the trader shall ensure that the consumer, when placing his order, explicitly acknowledges that the order implies an obligation to pay. But I would say not only to pay, merely to pay, but how much to pay. So perhaps the decisive question, we're just coming to the end, some criteria to calculate the appropriate price of consumer data. As Wolfgang Haber very clearly and brilliantly stated, firms know how much the service is valuable, so they should disclose in advance the price of data, also taking advantage of the consumer law key. And a good example that you mentioned is the Californian one, so that firms shall come up with a price and justify it. So, for instance, when you access online newspapers, you get confronted with the choice between allowing all possible cookies or paying a certain amount of money plus cookies. So you get confronted with the choice. When you would like to access a premium version of an app, of course, after having paid with data, you will pay with money. With insurance branch, there are several business models you already know. They pay as you drive, how many kilometers, pay how you drive, you transmit data even on your driving behavior, and manage how you drive. You get nudged, and if you comply with the nudging, you will save money. So the idea of having sufficiently informed content is a crucial one, and in terms of how to fight the apathy of the consumer, I guess we need more public law enforcement. So all those misleading information, all those missing information may lead to configuration of misleading action or misleading omissions according to the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. So the CJEU case law already, I would say already a few years ago, or in 2015 in the Air Berlin decision, that the traders shall indicate the full price, final price, comprising all voices of costs from the very first moment in which the consumer gets confronted with the offer. And this public law enforcement are nudging traders towards fairer behavior also in the data economy when we get asked to pay with personal data, maybe strengthened after the Modernization Directive introduced the new Article 13, Paragraph 3 of the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, providing fines up to 4% of the annual turnover in the member state or member states concerned for cross-border infringement. So this synergy between the existing acquis communautaire in terms of consumer rights and consumer and information and the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive may be useful in this regard. So if the rules, it is the rules on consumer protection which we need to improve. We need more transparency and to better merge between contract law and unfair commercial practices law. So the calculation and clarification in advance of personal data may be, as we saw, there are a lot of potential for further thoughts and discussion, and perhaps a duty to disclose what is the cost in terms of data, personal and non-personal, that the consumer provides. And this may deliver some useful thoughts for the update of the Sale of Goods Directive, which takes into account for IoT devices this achievement. So a book is coming very soon out of this conference, because we trust that all our distinguished speakers will deliver an outstanding contribution by the 15th of July. And just this and a very warm thanks to my co-organizers, Dirk Stademeyer and Rainer Schulze, for being so inspiring and for bringing to Ferrara, for creating such a good synergy, for bringing to Ferrara those bright minds and great persons that I'm privileged to host here. So I'm really deeply thankful for this opportunity of having you here, and I'm looking forward to having you back soon. Thank you so much.